objections or legal arguments. Don't want to get into multiple attorneys being involved in one part of the trial. Anybody have any confusion about that?
No, Your Honor.
Do you intend to concede guilt to any criminal charges, Mr. Prince?
No, Your Honor. Well, I should clarify. There was testimony last time about the vehicle being stolen. Obviously, Mr. Segura will plan to acknowledge that again, but...
That's not a charged offense?
Yes, sir. Correct.
Okay. I assume the parties request the rule of sequestration be invoked.
Yes, sir, with the exception of the victim's sister. I didn't have any objection to her remaining in the courtroom.
Her name, please.
Monica Peters.
What's that?
Monica Peters.
Okay. So she'll be excused from the rule?
Yes, sir.
And Your Honor, one further request is Jason Newland be able to come in and out when needed for purposes of wrangling the witnesses. He's mainly, if he's called, will be rebuttal purposes.
No problem with that, Mr. Prince?
No, Your Honor.
Okay. What about experts? Are some of the experts going to be allowed in the courtroom?
I think they would be. I don't know when everybody will be getting here, but obviously I don't have a legal basis to object to any expert being present for another expert's testimony that bears on his own testimony or her own testimony.
I mean, I know that's fairly standard, but I think we need to make it a record when one's going to be in the courtroom.
That's what I was going to say, Your Honor. As we go, we'll discuss it with each other, and then we'll make sure the court's aware and put on the record properly.
Okay. Just bring it to my attention so the record's clear. In case there is a dispute about that, I want to make sure we resolve it. So the rule of sequestration has been invoked. Are there any witnesses in the courtroom at this point in time?
They are not from the state, Your Honor. I know we have one outside, and I told them to arrive approximately 9:30, so he would be opening statement.
All right. Well, it'll be counsel's obligation to make their witnesses aware of the rule of sequestration. They need to remain outside the courtroom except while they're testifying. They're not to discuss their testimony with anyone else other than the attorneys. Make sure the witnesses are aware. We've had some problem in the last trial that was not communicated to the witnesses, and that caused some issue. Mr. Fuchs, you need to make sure that your witnesses are advised of that, because that was an issue in the last trial. Some of the witnesses were not informed, and then we had to deal with a little bit of a mess on that. So let's not have to deal with that again, please. I know you've got them scattered around, but you need to make sure they're aware of the rule of sequestration. You had a motion in limine, Mr. Fuchs.
Yes, Your Honor. The state would do an oral motion in limine regarding the letters that Brandy Peters had regarding James Santos that were in the house. Last time the state introduced them for the purpose of items that were found in the house. Throughout the course of the testimony and defense case, they used those letters to assert the truth of the matter asserted, and that they were in fact truthful, that Brandy was in fact involved in narcotics transactions and things along those lines. Based upon that, the state is moving in limine that they are in fact hearsay. They are being utilized for the truth of the matter asserted by defense, and therefore they should not be admitted into evidence as such.
Right, so you're not going to offer them into evidence this time as part of the search?
That is correct, Your Honor.
And this point of fact, I was just going back through my prior rulings on Mr. Santos, the letters, the emails. I haven't really quite finished that, but I did note that there was not a dispute on the letter. Is it one letter or two letters?
There's actually there's multiple letters that were found. I think that, and we ended up putting 2 in last time. I'm sorry.
All right.
Yeah, I think there were 2 last time that were put in, but we won't be putting it. We'll make sure we don't put any of them in.
And I haven't totally finished my review, but it seems like we may be in a different situation. if and when Mr. Santos testifies. But it seems to me that they're not admissible until we hear from him, and based upon his testimony, they may or may not become relevant. But I'll let you address that, Mr. Prince, if you have a different position.
That's what I was going to say, Your Honor. I was going to just ask that we defer a final ruling on that until we see what Santos says.
All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to grant the state's motion in limine without prejudice to renew once we hear the testimony of Mr. Santos or whoever else you think makes them admissible, but I would think that'd be primarily where that testimony might come from, and I can more accurately assess it at that point in time.
Yes, Your Honor. Also, word caution with the Dela Cruz, he may have relied upon those or in some way utilized those to form his opinion. Want to make sure we don't mention those during the opening statements along those lines until we're sure whether they come in or not.
Well, I think my ruling last time was that Dr. De La Cruz could testify, but he could not testify as the contents or statements by other people. It's not a way to admit hearsay. Would seem to be a similar situation. So I would again make that ruling, at least preliminarily, unless and let you be heard outside the presence of the jury if you think that's changed. Mr. Prince?
That's fine, Your Honor. Yes, sir.
All right. Anything else?
No, Your Honor. We do have a couple items we'd ask the court that we can remove so we can repackage them to make it a little quicker for court for trial. Of course, they've been in the custody of the clerks. 103EEFF, 105A, 107.
Wait a minute.
I'm sorry.
Johanna, throw a rock at it. All right. So 3EE, 3FF.
103.
103.
EE and FF.
Okay.
105A.
Okay.
107 and 109.
Okay. And these are items you want released to you so you can package them in a more presentable form.
That's correct, Your Honor.
You have a problem with that, Mr. Prince?
No, Your Honor.
Okay. Madam Clerk, you can release them to, who are they going to be released to?
Jason Newland, Your Honor.
All right. You can release those to Mr. Newland. All right. Anything else from the state?
Trying to make sure I do before I say no. Nothing further, Your Honor.
Mr. Prince?
I was just going to ask, Your Honor, that the state refrain from reporting Mr. McElfresh's statistical findings. At this point, the court indicated you would need to hear additional testimony about the statistical findings prior to that testimony being admitted. Mr. Pepys did confirm with Mr. McElfresh, I guess as of yesterday, that he used as a population sample for statistical analysis that is applicable for situations with unrelated individuals. It's a frequency of occurrence table for unrelated individuals.
Mr. Pepys?
Your Honor, I intend in opening statements to say that Dr. McElfresh found that Henry Segura's DNA at the scene, but not the frequency of occurrence, based upon the prior court ruling.
Okay.
That'd be fine.
When are we going to take up the statistical issue?
He's traveling up here on Tuesday is the arrangements we're making, so we can do so at that point if you want.
Just want to make sure we can do it at a time when we don't hold the jury up. So we want to do it at the end of the day or before court or something. The end of the day would be better so we don't have time limits. So,
we don't have flight arrangements yet, so we can.
What's that?
We don't have flight arrangements yet.
When do you think he would testify?
I'm anticipating he's going to test on the afternoon, Tuesday afternoon is what I'm hoping. But I don't know how well we're going to get there or not. But
Well, we're going to need to have a hearing before then, so I don't want the jury sitting in the jury room while we have a hearing, so we need to have some time where we can have his testimony before he testifies.
Okay, so we'll fly him up on Monday afternoon and have him here for first thing Tuesday morning. That work?
I think what would work better would be to have him here Tuesday afternoon and let him testify on Wednesday. I mean, we're not, you're talking about this coming Tuesday. We're not going to be having court Friday and Monday.
Correct.
I'm just afraid we're going to run out of time if we're doing it at 8:30 on Tuesday. That's my only concern.
And this time, I'm anticipating the state wrapping its case up on Wednesday morning if I've got it laid out correctly.
Okay.
And that includes Corbett testimony, and that's where I plugged him in.
Okay.
Obviously, that's
All
subject
right,
to
we'll get him here Monday. We'll take it up at 8:30 on Tuesday morning then.
All right.
That work for you, Mr. Friend?
Yes, sir.
Okay, okay. Any other issues from the defense?
No, sir.
So, to answer your question, I'll grant your motion in limine as to specific statistical findings without prejudice to be heard on that further. All right, anything else?
No,
We got other jurors here.
I'm not sure.
Okay. Well, we figure we'll start at 9 o'clock with the jury with preliminaries, instructions.
Thank you. I'm going to get my battery.
Okay, you're going to get it?
Yeah. That'll be right.
Start reading. You got all that, right?
Yes, they're all here. We'll check this out for our mic, everything should be working.
Okay, good. How we doing, Barbara?
I guess it's, this only has his prior testimony. It doesn't have the court announced the ruling on the record. I just need to make sure that I'm not drifting into anything that he says.
The last motion in the room.
Like that part's not broken. Yeah, they just cut it off at the end of the question.
But the other. I got that.
I guess I can just ask.
All right, that's all right. Don't worry about it.
Would that really be in big folder?
Try to just open these and see what the letters were, emergency letters stuff. I'll just do it right here.
That's fine. I mean, you can do whatever you want. I'm not objecting to chain of custody or anything. Do you know if we have the little thing that plugs into the USB drive? I guess I'll figure that out. I can get this thing. I got my jump drive to work. So they have one. Apparently, yeah. Thanks to my computer.
Sort it out.
Yeah, for it. Good.
We'll just talk about it after and stuff.
Sushi just wanted to.
Now, Jason and I talked about that one earlier.
Okay. You just brought me, I'm gonna figure that out. I knew y'all talked about it.
Everybody keeps asking the same question, the same person, and they're not talking to each other. And I don't understand why. I mean, they're the ones that are supposed to be wrangling.
But then this is what. I know, but you're the one who called the reason that they wanted to finish their chicken.
What's that? They didn't put that in.
How many days we're gonna need it. We got all the swings to lay out. I remember it went in an L last time.
When's the first time you were? Hey, what's that? Your third section or more long.
AKA. Not you don't mind most of it. So whatever you want to do is fine.
Most of it.
Most of us, neither one of us, is going to be sitting here, so whatever you want to do is fine.
These are separate ones for each day.
Yeah, no, those are just today. I've made multiple copies.
Okay.
All right, everybody line up? Yes, please. Come on, run.
All rise, come to order. Court is now in session.
Step to jury, please. Remain standing for the jury.
All right, everybody be seated, please. Good morning, folks. Thank you for being back here this morning. You've now been selected and sworn as a jury to try the case of State of Florida versus Henry Segura. As we've, of course, discussed, this is a criminal case. Mr. Segura is charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. Later, during the course of the trial, I will explain to you the exact elements of those offenses. The charging document, the indictment in this case, is not evidence, and you should not consider it as any proof of guilt. It's my job to explain the law to you. It's your job to decide the facts of the case and to apply the facts to the law. Thus, we have totally separate jobs, and that's one of our fundamental principles of our system of justice. I decide the law, you decide the facts, you apply the facts to the law. I know all of you see trials from time to time on TV, but you I don't see one from beginning to end, so it might be helpful if you understood the sequence of events. The next thing that will happen is the attorneys will be given an opportunity to make an opening statement. The opening statement gives the attorneys a chance to tell you what they believe the evidence will be presented during the trial. What the lawyers say is not evidence, and you're not to consider it as such. Following the opening statements, witnesses will be called to testify under oath. They will be examined and cross-examined by the attorneys. Documents and other exhibits also may be produced as evidence. After the evidence has been presented, I will instruct you on the law. The attorneys will then have an opportunity to make their closing arguments. Following the closing arguments by the attorneys and some brief comments by me, you'll retire to consider your verdict. You should not form any definite or fixed opinion on the merits of the case until you have heard all the evidence, the argument of the lawyers, and the instructions on the law that I will give you. Until that time, you are not to discuss the case among yourselves. Your verdict must be based solely on the evidence or lack of evidence and the law that I will explain to you. I now instruct you, you are not to communicate with anyone, including your fellow jurors, about this case. No communication includes no emailing, text messaging, tweeting, blogging, or any other form of communication. You cannot do research about the case or look up any information about the case. If you become aware of any violation of these rules at all, notify the court personnel. During the course of the trial, we will take recesses, and you will be permitted to separate and go about your personal affairs. During these recesses, you must not discuss the case with anyone, nor permit anyone to say anything to you or in your presence about the case. If anyone attempts to say anything to you or in your presence about the case, tell them that you're on the jury trying the case and ask them to stop. If they persist, leave them at once and immediately report the matter to the bailiff, who will advise me. The case must be tried by you only on the evidence presented during the trial, in your presence and in the presence of the defendant, the attorneys, and myself. Jurors must not conduct any investigation of their own. This includes reading newspaper, watching television, or using a computer, cell phone, the internet, any electronic device, or any other means at all to get information related to this case or the people and places involved in this case. This applies whether you're in the courthouse, at home, or anywhere else. You must not visit places mentioned in the trial or use the internet to look at maps or pictures to see any place discussed during the trial. In every criminal proceeding, a defendant has the absolute right to remain silent. At no time is it the duty of a defendant to prove his innocence. From the exercise of a defendant's right to remain silent, a jury is not permitted to draw any inference of guilt, and the fact that a defendant did not take the witness stand must not influence your verdict in any manner whatsoever. The attorneys are trained in the rules of evidence and trial procedure, and it is their duty to make all objections they feel are proper. When an objection is made, you should not speculate on the reason why it is made. Likewise, when an objection is sustained or upheld by me, you must not speculate on what might have occurred had the objection not been sustained, nor what a witness might have said had he or she been permitted to answer. If you would like to take notes during the trial, you're free to do so. On the other hand, you're not required to. That is entirely up to you. We've given you a notepad and a pen for your use if you wish to take notes. Any notes that you take will be for your personal use. However, you should not take them with you from the courtroom until you start your deliberations. During recesses, if you'll just leave your notes in your seat, the bailiff will ensure they are not tampered with by anyone. After you have completed your deliberations, the bailiff will destroy your notes. No one will ever read your notes. If you take notes, do not get so involved in note-taking that you become distracted from the proceedings. And you may wonder what I mean by that. We've had a rare instance where some juror decides to kind of act like a court reporter and write down everything that's said by all the witnesses. An important part of your job is to observe the witnesses, decide whether you think they're accurate historians or not. Don't get so buried in note-taking that you lose that function. Your notes should be used only as aids to your memory. Whether or not you take notes, you should rely on your memory of the evidence, and you should not be unduly influenced by the notes of other jurors. Notes are not entitled to any greater weight than each juror's memory of the evidence. During the trial, you will be permitted to ask questions of witnesses in case you missed something, you did not understand something, or you need to clarify a pertinent issue. The rules of evidence apply regardless of whether a question is asked by the attorneys, by me, or by you. Therefore, there may be a legal reason why I cannot ask your question. If I do not ask your question, you must not hold that against any of the parties, and please do not take it personally. Subject to that understanding, this is how we will proceed. When the attorneys have finished asking their questions, if you have a question, please raise your hand. I try to remember to stop and ask each time, but sometimes in my old age I forget. But we do it at the end of the questioning by the attorneys. We don't do it in the middle of the testimony, but at the end of the questioning, if you have a question, simply raise your hand. I will give you time to write your question on a clean piece of paper, and the bailiff will collect it. We don't do any questions by the jury verbally because I need to meet with the attorneys and discuss the question you've proposed. If I determine that it is a legally appropriate question, I will ask your question, and the attorneys may ask follow-up questions. If your question is not asked, you must not discuss it with other jurors or hold it against either party. The questioning of witnesses is the primary responsibility of the attorneys. You are not obligated to ask any questions, nor encouraged to ask large numbers of questions. However, if it will help your understanding of the case, you may do so. As I indicated, the next thing that's going to happen is the attorneys will be given an opportunity to make an opening statement. As I've also said, what the attorneys say is not evidence, and you should not consider it as such. However, I do encourage you to give them your careful attention. The opening statements are intended to give you an understanding of the evidence that the attorneys expect to present and the issues in the case. We'll start with the state of Florida. Mr. Fuchs.
Thank you, Your Honor. Hey, it worked. I'm always surprised when technology actually works the way you want it to. First thing I'd like to do is thank you. I know yesterday I thank you for taking part in the jury selection process. You were in fact now been selected to be the juror in this particular case, State of Florida versus Henry Segura. And I'd like to thank you. You were selected because myself, Mr. Prince, Mr. Segura, and of course the judge all felt you were the best ones to come in and listen to the evidence throughout the course of the trial, testimonial, look at the photographs, unfortunately, and thank you very much. Once again, we cannot do this without you. That being said, why are you here? Ladies and gentlemen, you are here because on November 20th, 2010, law enforcement officers responded to 908 Saddle Creek Run. This is the home of Brandy Peters. They're twins, Tamaya and Tanaya Peters, and her son, Henry Segura, or Javante Segura. Javante Segura also is the son of Henry Segura, the accused in this particular case. What the officers found when they arrived, Brandy Peters brutally shot and beaten. In the bathroom, they found Tamaya, Tanaya, and Javante in the bathtub. One of them shot, 2 of them drowned. And what the evidence is going to show you is that Henry Segura is responsible for the murders. You're going to hear throughout the course of this that he was interviewed by Tallahassee Police Department on 2 different occasions, days apart. First one was to notify them of the death of his son, and the second was follow-up. And what he did is he lied to law enforcement. He said, I was not there, I was at home the entire time. Tallahassee Police Department did their investigation, realized he was lying, called him in for a second interview to clarify. I was at home all the time, checked my cell phone records. They say I was there. But he made a mistake. He thought he could pull one over the eyes of Tallahassee Police Department. What they did is they found out he had a separate phone number that he didn't tell them about. And what they did when they checked that cell phone record is they determined he was in fact there at the time that Brandy Peters and the kids were killed. And it goes farther from there. So the question is, once we make the determination, what the evidence is going to show you, that Henry Segura had the motive, he had a means, and he had the opportunity to commit these murders, and he did in fact commit them. The next question is, how did we get there?
Somebody, phone going on. Let's not interrupt court, please.
As I said, law enforcement officers responded to the Saddle Creek Run home on November 20th, 2010. This home is located over by the fairgrounds, Capitol Stadium, Tram Road, Paul Russell Road, South Monroe Street. And there's the 4-point area right here. Law enforcement officers respond, they get a call. It was actually Artron Timmons who went up there first to do a check because his mom calls him and tells him to go look, so they haven't heard anything from Brandy Peters that day. He walks up and sees blood outside the home. Calls law enforcement. Officer Jernigan, Officer Kidd respond first and foremost, and they approach the home. They go into the home, and they are able to force entry by breaking a window, and they realized what was happening there. They're later joined by Sean Wyman, Officer of Tallahassee Police Department, and they go into the home and they found what you've already seen. What you're going to hear next, of course, is that they withdraw from the house. Once they clear the house, make sure nobody's still alive, make sure nobody's still hiding in the house. They withdraw from the house. They secure the scene. This is the home there on Saddle Creek Run. Secure it with the tape. You can see here the window that they had to break in order to gain entry to the home. And they contact the Criminal Investigative Division of Tallahassee Police Department. Investigator Mark Lewis is assigned to be the primary lead investigator of this case. The lead investigator is kind of like the head coach of a football team, or any other team for that matter. And the fact that he doesn't necessarily do all the investigative aspects of it, but he's kind of the leader of them, and he assigns his assistant coaches, if you will, to do different roles throughout the course of the investigation. You're going to hear that crime scene investigators were called. I know we talked a little bit about CSI shows and stuff like that, but they are, in fact, real-life crime scene investigators. Annie Pressey is the primary investigator for this particular case from Crime Scene. April DeBrava is another investigator that's assigned to the Criminal Investigative Division, and what her role is to be a liaison between the crime scene investigators as they're processing the entire crime. They, of course, have training to do so. You're going to hear that there's a lot of blood in this. Throughout the entire house, they process the entire house room by room by room. April DeBrava's role is to do a liaison, to look from things from an investigative standpoint as an investigator rather than a crime scene specialist. She also reports back, of course, as I said, she would be one of the assistant coaches for Mark Lewis. And they do, in fact, process the scene. They look for the evidence in the house. They look for evidence around the victims, and of course, outside the home. And they start asking questions. They start asking questions to the family member. Who does she know? Why is this important? It's important to know who she knows because of the brutality of this. Law enforcement suspects that it's somebody she knew because of the brutality of it. So they want to know who she knows, who's possibly responsible, who can give them leads as to who she may have been seen with the night before, things along those lines. They start asking questions about time frames. Again, she's found early in the morning. Time frames, when's the last time somebody seen them? When you saw them last, what were they doing? Things along those lines. General information, habits, time to eat, time the kids go to bed, things along those lines. And what they find out is that she does in fact have her cell phone on her all the time, much like most of us do. Has the phone on her all the time, constantly using it. They find out that she was last seen the night before in the late afternoon, early evening hours. That the twins, one of the twins was and Javante actually were seen with Burger King wrappers shortly after they had eaten Burger King, or appeared to be shortly after they had eaten Burger King. They talked to friends, find out when she was last talked to. Last talked to again, late afternoon, early evening hours. Of course, they find out how the bodies were discovered. As I mentioned earlier, Artron's mom calls over there, can't get Brandy to respond. It's out of ordinary because of the fact that she usually responds to her cell phone. And she sends her son over there, at which point he comes back and reports to law enforcement. They find out possible boyfriend she's with. Does she have any boyfriends, family members? And they also find out about the fathers of the children. And when they find out it's the father of the children, for Tamaya and Tanaya, the twins, is Antonio Anthony. And the father of Javante Segura is in fact Henry Segura. It's obviously important because you got to let them know about what happened. What they also do is they take a look at Brandy's cell phone. Try and see if they can narrow some things down. Who's she been talking to last? They find out around 6:11 to 6:15 is a call between Brandy and her mom. You get a text from 6:53 from Cece Timmons, Artron Timmons' mom, that we just talked about. They also find out that that 6:53 text is the last active communication on Brandy's phone. These are terms you're going to start hearing. You're probably going to learn a lot more about cell phones than you ever thought possible. But there's a difference. Active communication is one in which the recipient of the phone, Brandy in this particular case, is sending something out. That is an active communication. It means they're participating and actively participating in the conversation. There are also passive events. Passive events are things that are incoming. Someone calling and leaving a voicemail, calling a text message with no response, things along those lines. And what they find out, of course, is that 6:53 was the last active communication. At 7:13 is a passive event, incoming. 7:49, another passive event. And finally at 8:21, a routed event. And what you're going to learn is a routed event is one that happens when the phone is shut down, when it can't communicate with a tower. Battery removed, turned off, something along those lines. And that 8:21, the phone has been powered down at 8:21 and never heard from again. And you're going to see an analysis of Brandy's phone. And this here, whoops. And this is that, in fact, analysis. And what you can see here is we're enlarging the time frame, and it starts 1 week prior to the homicide. And these are all the communications that she has during that course of that week. Both active and passive. But you can see it's in constant use. Look at the time frames. Every couple of seconds, every couple of minutes, she's using that phone constantly. She's on it constantly. Now, each one of these lines are going to be later explained to you what they all mean by Chris Corbett. He's going to explain what each one of these lines are. But right here, what we're talking about is the time and date. That's it. It just stops. And it stops and it's never heard from again at 8:21. So that begs the question, why did it stop? And why is that 6:53 the last active communication? Is that the time period in which the murder occurred? You're of course going to hear that there was an autopsy conducted. Autopsy in both Brandy and the children. And you're going to find and hear that there was food that was found in the stomach of Tamaya and Tanaya. You're going to hear from Dr. Flanagan, who was the autopsy medical examiner, about the time frames that were involved. And it would be a couple of hours, if you roughly. Can't hammer down an exact time. Again, this isn't CSI TV. But the general idea would be within a couple of hours of their death, they'd eat. Again, you go back to Archon Timmons' testimony about the fact that he last saw them eating Burger King in the late afternoon, early evening hours of that 19th. And that is in fact consistent with the Brandy's phone becoming inactive at that time period. In addition to that, you'll see photographs in the crime scene. There's an open food canister there on the table. Spoon still in it. Again, eating patterns, roughly early evening, or late afternoon, early evening. Consistent. So at this point, law enforcement has determined who she knows, who she communicates, who's the father of her children, possibly what time the deaths occurred, and they start looking, trying to figure out who may have possibly had a motive. Law enforcement training experience, typically in a crime scene such as this, you're talking about money, love, jealousy, things along those lines. That's usually what you primarily look at first and foremost. Who has the means? Who's got the ability to do this? Because of the crime scene, the brutality of this, who's got the ability to do this with the strength that it would cause? Because you're going to hear from the medical examiner that part of the skull was actually crushed. The bone was crushed. Who's got that kind of strength? Murder weapon. What was the murder weapon? You're going to hear from Florida Department law enforcement analyst Jeff Foggy that in fact what happened here is a .32 caliber pistol, most likely. 32 calibers are interesting. You're going to hear that 32 calibers actually have two different kinds of bullets that go with it. There are 32 caliber long and 32 caliber short. And what you're going to hear is that if somebody puts the wrong ammunition in a different gun, they use, for instance, in this case, a .32 short when it should be a .32 long, the weapon will fire but it doesn't fire right. In other words, it doesn't gain the velocity that is needed to actually penetrate a skull and do the damage you would normally think of regarding a bullet. Then we go back to Dr. Flanagan's autopsy. And what we find is that that's exactly what happened here. That these bullets that entered Brandy didn't do so with the velocity you normally would expect. They actually didn't penetrate bone in some way, in some instances. What that tells us is that whoever it is may not have known quite how to use a gun properly. Wasn't real familiar with firearms. So the question is, murder weapon, who had one? But at the same time, just because you have one doesn't mean you necessarily know how to use it right. So who could that be? Who had the opportunity? Who was there? Who had access to the kids? Who had access to Brandy, to the home? You're going to hear that this was not a forced entry. The door wasn't kicked in. It was kicked in eventually by law enforcement, but when they respond, nobody kicked the door in. Nobody forced their entry. So somebody was led into this home. You can find Henry Segura. Initial interview, notify him because of a child. Look for nonverbal cues, emotional, lack of emotion, deceptions, and of course they apply common sense in conducting these interviews. You can have an opportunity to see it. Henry Segura is told his son is killed. Doesn't show any emotion. And we talked about that in opening statements. Not everybody grieves in the same way. Didn't show any emotions. Again, I was home on the 19th. Was there all night. Wasn't me. Couldn't have done it. Told law enforcement to check his phone records. He gives a phone number of 509-4380. That's my phone number. Check it. Phone records say I was home. So the next day, he went in the morning. He went to his friend Silas Thornton's house. When officers asked, he gave a phone number for Silas Thornton, 408-8669. So now there's a investigative team division meeting, and they're talking, and they're sitting around talking. Chris Corbett, you're going to hear from. He's a phone analyst. He's the one that's going to talk to you about what cell phones can and can't do, and how it relates into this particular case. And you'll hear a little bit more about that in a second. So as they're sitting around their meeting and they're sharing notes about what they've learned, what he says is that 408-8669 was in contact with Brandy Peters all day long on the 19th. This is the number that Henry Segura says belonged to Silas Thornton. So what does law enforcement do? They go down and interview Silas Thornton. Lives down in the Sop Choppy area, in McCulloch County, south of town. And when they interview Silas Thornton, what he says is, yeah, it was my phone. It got damaged at one point. It got wet. I put it in a bag of rice. I was with Henry Segura at the time, and I was working. They're both welders. I was with Henry Segura during the time period. I put it in a bag of rice. It was his suggestion to do so. And he left that phone in Henry Segura's truck. And then from that point on, Henry Segura used that phone. Not Silas Thornton. Henry Segura. Didn't tell law enforcement that back on the 19th or the 20th when he was interviewed. So now we have two phone numbers in play. We have the one that Henry Segura says is mine, the one that he says is Thornton's, that we've now learned is Henry Segura's. And what we find out when we analyze those is with regard to that 408-8669 number, at 11:30 a.m. there's a phone call from that phone to Brandy. But in that phone, for some reason, star 67 was used. Star 67 is the function that you use in order to hide who is calling. But she answered the phone, and they talked for 56 minutes, clearly indicating it's someone she knows and has a conversation with. Consistent, once again, with Henry Segura. Between 118 and 128, series of calls to Brandy, again, star 67 used for some reason, blocking his caller ID, but she obviously knows him because she talked to him just a little while ago on that same phone number. (213), another phone call. 2 minutes, 35 seconds. Again, star 67 used, trying to hide it. Deception. At 2:19, so again, 2:13, almost 3 minutes on a phone call. Right afterward, at 2:19, she sends a text number to 509-4380. This is the phone number that Henry Segura says was mine. What does that tell you? The evidence shows in this particular case that this phone number, this phone call at 2:13, from the phone number that Henry Segura says wasn't his, it was Silas Thornton's, that he was keeping secret, that he kept using star 67 on to hide his identity, and that phone number, she sends a text to his regular number and says, "You hang up on me?" Tells you that phone call was Henry Segura, and that she then used his normal number to question about why he hung up. He hung up on me? What does that tell you? 2:19, they fighting? On day of the murder? Shortly thereafter, there's another phone call from 408-869 to Brandy where he uses star 67 again. Again, hiding it. Once again, that's a phone number that Henry Segura gave to law enforcement as Silas Thornton's phone number. But law enforcement investigates further. And they find multiple friends, Silas Thornton, Tyra Wilcoxon, and Miss Hawthorne Smith, that all say, I communicate with Henry Segura on that phone number around the times of the murder, those dates surrounding the murder. So they have independent confirmation from not only Silas Thornton, but also other friends and girlfriends of Henry Segura that that is in fact the number that he utilizes, that 408-8669 number that he says wasn't mine, it was Silas Thornton's phone number. Deception. Micro-emotions, deception. So now the next question is, was there motive? We've already seen the 219 phone call or text message, did you hang up on me? Is there some sort of fighting going on between the two of them? Motive usually involves, as I said, money, love, relationship, jealousy, things along those lines. And what we find out is shortly there before this murder occurred, Henry Segura is behind on his child support payments of over $20,000. $20,000, a lot of money. You're also going to hear from a friend of his, lifelong friend of his, who's going to come in and testify. And what he's going to tell you is that he's also a welder at the time. And that they were discussing, he and Henry were talking about getting a job over in Afghanistan. Lots of money to be made over in Afghanistan during this time period, doing welding and things, six-figure jobs. A lot of money to be made. But to go to Afghanistan, you have to have a visa from the United States and Afghanistan to travel to and from. The problem with that is he can't get one if he owes over $2,500 in child support. So it's not only the $20,000 in child support in arrears, but now that child support for Javante stands in the way of making six-figure salaries and traveling to do so. Is there means? Strength, murder weapon. Does he have one? He's a big guy. He's a welder. An opportunity to see him here in court, of course. But that's what he does. As a welder, you got to move metal around on a regular basis. Big, strong. Does he have the strength to carry it out? Again, as I said, one of these blows crushed the skull. Does he have the strength? I'd say he does. Does he have a gun? Again, that lifelong friend, Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore's former military. He knows about guns through both military and personal. And what he's going to say is, prior to the murders, I saw Henry Segura with a .32 in his car. Again, .32 is the kind of weapon that was shot, that Brandy was shot with, Milo shot with. You're also going to hear that he's asked his girlfriend and told her, I need a throwdown gun, just before the murders. Law enforcement will explain what a throwdown gun is. A throwdown gun is one that you can just throw down and it's not traceable back to you. She didn't supply it, but that's what he requested and talked to her about doing. Why? So we know he's got the motive. We know he's got the means to the gun, the strength, asking for a throwdown gun. But does he have the opportunity? Remember, does he have access to the kids? Was he actually at the home? He says, I was home all day. Check my phone records. Well, access to the home, he's not heavily involved with the kids, but he does know them and was at one point. They know him. Obviously behind on child support. House was not broken into. Door wasn't kicked in. Does he have the access to the home where somebody would let him in? Got communication with Brandy all day? I would submit, yes. He would have access to the home in that manner. We also go back to the cell phone records. Once again, they compare the phone record for Brandy, but now they're also looking at the undisclosed phone, as we call it. This is the phone number, that 8669, that Henry Segura elected not to tell law enforcement officers when he was told about the death of his son, and then drug law enforcement officers. Both phones are inactive between 6:53 and 7:23. And if you go back and you think about the times of the death that we previously talked about, and the inactiveness of her phones, that long list of scrolling ended at 8:21 with the last text message that she sent out prior to that. Brandy's continually remains inactive, never returns. 2 short data sessions, and your data sessions are internet type access to your phone, but that doesn't mean you're actually searching the internet. Your phone can auto refresh certain internet things. If you have, say, CNN pulled up on your phone and you aren't using your phone, it still may refresh, even though you're not actually having it in your hand. Those are what data sessions are. So there's data sessions at 7:23, and then a text is sent at 7:37. And both phones, again, are inactive from 7:37 to 8:21. And at 8:21, that's the time period that we know that last call went out of that last time that we know Brandy's phone is powered down at 8:21. At 8:21, exact same time period, exact same time, Henry Segura makes a 2-second call, immediate disconnect. No connection. 1-1000, 2-1000, butt dial. Now, this is where cell phone stuff gets even more interesting. When you're talking about cell phone, there are certain things called RTT. What is a time calculation, time distance calculation? And the way that cell phones are structured, that the signal that your cell phone takes a certain amount of time to get from one to the tower to your cell phone and back. That's your time distance calculation does. It doesn't give you an exact GPS coordinate. Back then, keep in mind we're talking about 2000. We're not talking about today. Phones are a little bit different now than they were then. It doesn't give you an exact GPS coordinate, but it does give you distance from the tower. So if you know the location of the tower, if you know the distance, you can create kind of a little arc, or at least the general area you're talking about there. And if you know where all these towers are, you can plot it out. You can actually narrow it down even further. Each tower has got a section, 3 different sections to them. And they go out and they're roughly a third, but they're not always exactly a third. So it's kind of divided up into 3 pieces of a pie, if you will. And that can narrow it down in that particular direction that the phone was communicating. If it was on this particular sector off this particular tower, we know it's going to be roughly in that 3rd quadrant in that general direction. And you can kind of get an idea of where phones are during that time period and using this database. So law enforcement go back and do exactly what Henry Segura said to do. Go back, check my phone records. It shows I'm home. 509-4380. And the phone was exactly where he said it was. It was at his home. The only problem was everything was inactive. Everything was passive. There's nothing outgoing. The phone was there, but was Henry Segura? So now we go back and we take a look at this 408-8669 number, the one that he says belongs to Silas Thornton, not my phone number. And you take a look at that particular phone number, which we now know to be Henry Segura's. And when you plot those sectors and time distance calculation, a rough sector right there, there's our Saddle Creek Run with the arcs. Those are the communications between 6 o'clock and 8:21, November 19th, 2010, at the time of the murder, from that phone number. But we're not done. What law enforcement then do is they go out and they get with Silas Thornton, and they have Silas Thornton go with them, and they purchase the exact same phone that Silas Thornton said was his that now belongs to Henry Segura, that 8669. And they take that exact same phone, they hook it up to the exact same carrier, and they run a series of tests. They run phone calls, they run text messaging, and they run data access. Almost 100 of them are amassed during this time period. Okay? They stand inside Brandy Peters' home. They stand inside the living room where the murder occurred. They go to his house, Henry Segura's house. And they go back and they plot it. Just like they did for that 8669 phone number. And when they plot all the data that they utilized, looks familiar. It was exactly the same. They did this from her living room, and this is the data that they got, and that's the data from that 8669 phone number. What we know, Henry Segura has got the motive, he's got the means, and he's got the opportunity for this murder. We're not done. You're going to hear from Dr. Kevin McElfresh. Dr. McElfresh got a long history of analyzing and interpreting DNA over 30 years. He does analysis on, quite frankly, mass type stuff. So he's looking at very low frequency or very low amounts of DNA and making determinations. In fact, he even does testimony, or he does stuff for Department of Defense with Whom the Unknown Soldier. He had a hand in the analysis of September 11th. He had an analysis of Indonesia and identifying the victims of those particular events. And he goes back and he makes an analysis. And he is asked to take a look at a grab bar, a DNA swab from a grab bar that is right there in the bathtub, right above where the children are found. And what he finds is a mixture containing Henry Segura's DNA. And ladies and gentlemen, when you put together the motive, the means, the deception, the opportunity, the DNA, you're left with one conclusion: that Henry Segura committed this particular murder and is responsible for the murder of Brandy Peters, Tamaya and Tanaya Peters, and Javante Segura. Thank you.
Well, we take 10 minutes. We'll let Jerry step out. Either side need anything?
No, Your Honor.
All right, we'll take 10 minutes. Let you step out with the deputy.
That's mine, yeah. It goes on my computer.
Does that go? Oh,
No, it's on my
do
computer.
they have one that goes specifically with this thing?
No. No, I don't. I didn't, no, because I don't remember.
Thank you.
Wedge myself in there, though, I think whenever it comes time, let's say, if I go in there and pull that in there, he doesn't get me ready to get behind and get it out.
I didn't make a bad joke.
I can smooth into it.
Exhibit number 1. Obviously, and I'll put on there.
If you have to do one,
Why not?
because you already have one. Will I
Not-
photo of Fran?
No, this is Court Exhibit, not, no, it's not evidence.
Alright.
It's Court Exhibit.
Oh.
It's not, you don't have one back.
Have what?
PowerPoint?
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out how to get it up there and then here it's scroll through. Then
Wait a minute. Are you available for 3G? Oh, it's going to be, please. PowerPoint of the laptop. I don't know if that's for me to set up a new one. They're taking a break. They have a break right now. All right? Okay.
is this Fuchs? Eddie? that?
and get appointed as an executive.
Oh, okay. Okay, good deal.
Set this up like we do.
I won't be able to sign.
No sound?
No.
This is Forensic Specialist Andy Pressey, ID 867.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it. Oh. Thank you. Appreciate your help.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And normally you have like 3 or 4 and they all close that.
Okay.
We got one for Yeah, there's a pointer on my phone.
Yeah, I got one. That's there's one on the box. I meant to go buy one last night. I forgot. Yeah, we need another one actually. Oh, yeah.
He said they did get it? Yeah. He said, well, who are we missing? Anybody? Okay, y'all get ready.
Frank.
Okay. Tell him Mr. Prince has a question before we bring him in here.
All rise, court is back in session.
Be seated, please.
You have an issue, Mr. Brent?
Yes, sir.
Everybody be seated.
I was just trying to do a last minute double check regarding Santos. I'm going to be general with reference to him, but I want to make sure that I wasn't going to cross into anything that the court had previously prohibited. My transcript that I was trying to check cut off prior to the court's ruling. So basically what I intended to say is that he's a drug trafficker. At some point he recruited Brandy to mule cocaine for him. He became aware that she was basically skimming drugs, and when she refused to pay back for the drugs that she had stolen, that he had her killed. That's what I intend to say.
Right. Does somebody have a page number where my ruling is? I would like to reread that, but I know, what's that?
Get it to you. I don't have it right here though. I'll apologize.
It's got to be right after page 87. That's where the
On
testimony.
which volume?
This is a motion hearing excerpt from August 2nd, 2017.
August 2nd, 2017, after page what?
After page 87. Is where the testimony is.
Okay. All right, I'll look at that, but I don't need it this instance, but, I mean, I recall my ruling. I wanted to look at it a little more specifically, but that doesn't cross the line. We ready for a jury?
Yes, sir.
No, just for record purposes, the only issue I have with that is we have no coming Santos to Santos. If he comes in and pleads the fifth, just before his testimony, that could be problematic, but anyway.
That could happen with anybody's witnesses, including yours. So at this point, he said on the record he is going to testify, so there's certainly a good faith belief that he's going to. So anyway, I'm not going to prohibit that. All right, let's have a jury, please.
All rise for the jury.
Everybody be seated, please. You may proceed, Mr. Prince.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning again, folks. Again, my name's Nate Prince, and like Mr. Fuchs says, I do want to, before I get into any of the evidence that we're going to talk about over the course of the trial, again, thank you for your time and attention to this matter. Obviously, there's a high-stakes case before you, and it's important to both the state and the defense. And so your careful attention to the specifics of the evidence and the testimony, as well as the arguments by counsel, is always appreciated. Opening statement is, as probably was apparent from Mr. Fuchs' argument to you, kind of our opportunity to give you a preview of what evidence we anticipate introducing during the trial. In addition to that, though, you're going to hear law from the court, which he'll instruct you about. The only thing that I ask you regarding the court's instructions to keep in mind as we go through the process of introducing evidence in this case is that the ultimate question you're going to be answering at the end of the trial is one of evidence. It's one that depends on the state proving beyond and to the exclusion of every reasonable doubt that the defendant is the person who committed this offense. You won't hear any dispute from the defense that this is the most heinous offense that's been committed in Tallahassee. There isn't any argument against that. The problem is that it wasn't Mr. Segura. And I know that because this is a heinous offense, you're going to want to see evidence that not only makes you feel comfortable returning a not guilty verdict, but also puts you at ease with the fact that the state really did fail to meet its burden. And so to that end, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about some of the evidence that you're going to hear from the defense during the case. First and foremost, I want to talk about evidence pertaining to motive. Obviously, if the evidence pertaining to motive doesn't make sense or falls through or is rebutted by other evidence, then that's a problem for the state with its case. Mr. Fuchs told you about, and you will hear evidence and testimony indicating that Mr. Segura had recently had a $20,000 roughly child support judgment placed against him by Ms. Peters, by Brandy Peters, and that there were all kinds of consequences that went along with that. He was subject to being incarcerated. He was subject to having his driver's license suspended. He was subject to having his tax refund seized. He couldn't work internationally, as Mr. Fuchs said. Also, he couldn't get any professional licenses that he held or would have held renewed or granted in the first place, and his wages could have been garnished. What the state didn't know, what law enforcement didn't know when they developed that evidence, was that Mr. Segura was already in that position with someone else. Another child's mother that Mr. Segura had previously, Tamika Hawkins, who hates his guts but will testify on his behalf in this case, she had obtained a child support judgment of an almost identical amount some years before this happened, and it was still in place, which is to say he already couldn't travel internationally because Tamika Hawkins had a $20,000 judgment against him. He had already dealt with having himself put in jail and getting out by making a partial payment. He had already dealt with having his license suspended and getting it reinstated by making a partial payment. He had already figured out ways to work around having his taxes seized, which is to say that he would work on jobs where he could be paid under the table, and he would work all over the country. so that it wasn't easy to, find out where he was and seize his assets as they came in. He also, because he wasn't able to get professional licenses, worked jobs that he didn't have to have a professional license for. He would just take a competency test at the beginning of the job wherever he would go, and then he would perform his welding duties from there. Similarly with the garnished wages, he had already figured out if he moved around and got paid under the table that he could avoid all of that. Ms. Hawkins will tell you that notwithstanding the fact that he didn't responsibly pay for their daughter, Janae, he was a father to her. He didn't, try to do anything in reprisal against Ms. Hawkins for having this child support judgment put on him. He just figured out a way to deal with. And I'll go ahead and tell you now, so that you're not wondering about this, Mr. Segura has not ever, and will not in this case at this time, hide behind his Fifth Amendment right, although he has a right to do that, and although you wouldn't be able to hold it against him if he did that. He'll take the stand, and he'll testify, and he'll tell you his side of the story. And what you'll hear, it's kind of difficult for me to articulate this, but Mr. Segura's quote is probably most apt, which is that there ain't no black man anywhere in America killing somebody over child support. That's just not something that happens. It's something that he says culturally, you just deal with. You know how to deal with. Nobody's killing anybody over child support, first and foremost. Now, one of the things that the state is going to try and point to during the course of the trial, evidence that they'll look to try and establish that there was some kind of beef brewing between Brandy and Mr. Segura here, was that there were text messages early in the week of the murder, on Monday, Tuesday that week, where she's saying, basically, you're a deadbeat, you're not paying, I'm going to have you put in jail and all this. However, there's a change of tone in the text messages that takes place prior to the murder. On Wednesday, Mr. Segura goes over to Brandy Peters' house. He's there for a short time, and basically what he's doing there is trying to chill her out. He figures, I'll just go see her in person, I'll explain what the situation is, and the situation was that Mr. Segura had been injured. He had been shot back in July of the same year, 2010, and he hadn't been able to work for some period of time. And so he'd gotten behind on, all kinds of payments, not just child support, but all kinds of payments. And so he basically goes over there and talks to Brandy and cools her down, and the best evidence of that are Brandy's own words. Because on Thursday, we see that Brandy sends Mr. Segura a text message saying, hey, you were looking good yesterday. If you weren't my baby daddy, I would have given you some. Clearly indicating that the meeting on Wednesday went well. Immediately after that, and you're going to hear testimony all throughout the trial, that Mr. Segura is a well-known philanderer, basically. And the only difference between his philandering at the time of the murder and his prior philandering was that he wasn't supposed to be doing it anymore, which I know that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but just so you have some factual background, you're going to hear testimony indicating that about a year and a half prior to the murders in this case, Mr. Segura had an infant son named Jalik who passed away because he was born prematurely. Prior to that point in his marriage with Malika Segura, his wife of 12 years or so, he had cheated on her a bunch of times. He had Janae out of wedlock. He had other girlfriends. He was constantly running around on her. After Jalik passed away, he and Malika got together and talked about what effect that was going to have on their marriage moving forward, and what, if anything, it meant for them from a spiritual perspective and all that. And Mr. Segura committed at that time that he wasn't going to run around on her anymore. Well, he didn't hold to that. He continued to run around on her, including with Brandy. And you're going to see evidence of how that ended up playing out. So understanding, with respect to the motive, that Mr. Segura already faced all of the consequences, was already subject to all of the consequences that the state will be indicating motivated him to have to kill Brandy. He was already subject to that. There were no new consequences other than the total value of money owed, which again he could easily get around and manipulate just by making partial payments. You can't talk about motive, though, without talking about the other folks who had motive to kill Brandy Peters. So you're going to hear about Carlos Santos, James Carlos Santos, during this trial. James Carlos Santos is a drug trafficker, a member of the Vice Lords, who brought Brandy in at some point in the 2000s to work for him as a mule. He would work with the Los Zetas cartel in El Paso and in Brownsville, Texas, pick up loads of drugs, bring them to the southeastern United States, Atlanta in particular, for distribution. He recruited Brandy to work as a mule for him, and she did indeed start working for him. At some point, he became aware that she was lifting drugs off the deliveries. It was a significant amount, and he knew at that point it was on him to take care of it. Otherwise, he would be taken care of by the Zetas. And so he set out to take care of the problem. Mr. Santos will testify in this trial. Mr. Santos will admit to you that he ordered the murders, that he orchestrated the murders, that he recruited a local trap team, DeMario Paramore and Haywood Griffin, who were other drug traffickers based in Tallahassee, not on the level that Mr. Santos was, to serve as the local guys to kind of show his team, his drug cartel associates, how to get in and out of Brandy's neighborhood. And that's exactly what happened. So you'll hear evidence and testimony about that from Mr. Santos. You know, and I know that sounds strange that he's going to admit to that, but he has a specific reason for doing so, and he'll tell you about that as well. His face isn't clean, as the term goes. His face isn't clean until and unless he specifically takes care of the problem, because he's the one who brought Brandy in. He's the one who's responsible for her. So not only does he have to take care of the problem, he has to be sure that his cartel associates know that he's the one who took care of the problem. So that's why he's going to be here testifying. You're also going to hear testimony from the defense cartel expert, Dr. Dela Cruz. Dr. Dela Cruz will tell you generally about the relationship between South American cartel families, Mexican cartels, who generally serve as middlemen to deliver the product into the United States, and American criminal street gangs who receive drugs from Mexican cartels and deal them on street level, which is where the money is made. Another thing that Dr. Dela Cruz will testify about is the tactics used generally by cartels when they have to correct a transgression against their business interest. They don't do things that aren't theatrical. They're meant to be extraordinarily violent, extraordinarily gruesome, to shock everyone's conscience in order to send a message to anybody else that would presume to interfere with their business or tamper with their product. One of the things that Dr. Dela Cruz will offer you is a suggestion that, and you know, to be clear, he has specific experience with first-person interviews, people who were associated with and members of the Los Zetas cartel. One of the things that they do is that they'll leave a calling card or instruct whoever is committing a murder in their name to leave a calling card at the scene so that it's well known that the killing was committed in order to vindicate their business interest. That happened in this case. In this case, next to the victim's body, there was a spade placed. The spade is in the spatter zone, which is to say, this was, and you'll hear testimony, this was a highly dynamic crime scene where Ms. Peters was fighting violently to save herself and her children. She was up and down off of the floor in the moments before she was killed, and that all of the carpet there is covered in blood spatter, which is basically splashing blood as the offense is being committed. The shovel was not apparently used in the murder. It had no DNA from Ms. Peters on it. It was placed there after the murder within the spatter zone, and no blood was found on it. All of that you'll be able to take into account when weighing what evidence supports the theory that the cartel had the motive and did in fact carry out the murders. You're also going to hear evidence about Mr. Paramore and Mr. Griffin, the local drug traffickers who Mr. Santos ultimately recruited to serve as the trap team to show his cartel associates the way in and out of Ms. Peters' subdivision. At some point during the course of the investigation, the Tallahassee Police Department received information from a man named Gregory Washington, who's a criminal defendant who was looking to get credit for himself on his own cases. They received information that Mr. Washington's cousin, who was Mr. Paramore, had confessed to being involved in these killings. The Tallahassee Police Department was familiar with Mr. Washington, so they didn't necessarily want to use him, but because of the seriousness of the case, they decided to do so. They documented him as a confidential informant, they put a wire on him, and they sent him to talk to his cousin, DeMario Paramore. When he did that, investigator Vinny Basio was listening on the wire, and he heard Mr. Washington elicit from Mr. Paramore statements indicating that he was, in fact, involved in the murder, that Brandy was killed because she didn't repay the drugs that she had taken, and that the children were killed because, quote unquote, dead men don't talk. Investigator Basio will be called by the defense and he'll offer that testimony here in open court for you to assess. Then you'll be able to consider the testimony of Haywood Griffin. Part of the reason Mr. Santos recruited Mr. Griffin and Mr. Paramore was that they were former business associates of a man named Kenny Green, who was basically Brandy's boyfriend. And Mr. Green and these folks had had a falling out over drugs, failure to repay, Mr. Green's failure to repay them for fronted drugs, I suppose. Mr. Griffin, after being arrested on unrelated drug trafficking charges, was interviewed by the Tallahassee Police Department pertaining to his potential involvement in this case. First, he claimed, you'll hear, that he didn't even know who Kenny Green was. Then he said, well, I guess I did see Kenny Green at the jail one time. Then he said, well, I guess I kind of know who he is from around town. Then he finally admitted that he knew him. And then finally, at the end of the interview, he admitted not only did he know him, but they were former drug trafficking associates and that they had had a falling out. I'll ask you at the end of the case to consider why Mr. Griffin would lie about that if he had nothing to do with the case. An additional piece of evidence which ties Mr. Griffin to the scene of the murder in this case is his own phone records. You'll see that his phone was communicating with a tower close to Brandy's house, facing the sector of the tower that is closest to Brandy's house, which is to say the directionality from the tower in which his phone was committing was towards Brandy's house. Now, that was also towards his own house. So his house was in the same sector of the same cell tower. So is that conclusive evidence that he was there at the scene? Absolutely not. And we don't have the kind of distance from tower data that Mr. Fuchs was talking about during his own opening for Mr. Griffin. So we don't know exactly how far his handset was from the phone, which would give us a better idea of whether he was at his own house or whether he was at Brandy's house. But that's all evidence that you'll be able to consider. The next general group of evidence you're going to hear is evidence pertaining to DNA. And at this point, I think it bears mentioning, and you'll hear testimony about this, exactly what the Florida Department of Law Enforcement is. So the Florida Department of Law Enforcement is exactly that. It's a law enforcement agency that develops all types of physical evidence for the state. So they have shoe impression experts, they have DNA experts, they have blood spatter experts, experts of all kinds. And on criminal cases every day all around the state, every prosecutor in every jurisdiction in this state sends evidence to FDLE for further analysis. Generally, the state attorney's offices all over the state are not required and don't go outside of FDLE to hire independent contractors like private attorneys do. They have a state agency specifically for that. And that took place here. In this case, there were over 200 evidentiary samples taken from the crime scene and other scenes, and those were sent off to FDLE. The person who will report either, if she's, I don't know if she'll be called by the state or by the defense, but effectively, Jo Ellen Brown, a senior analyst from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, will testify as a defense expert, insofar as she's going to testify that Mr. Segura was not included to a single evidentiary exhibit found at the crime scene. She will, however, testify that other foreign DNA was found in places relevant to the investigation, relevant to the case. So the first place we're going to talk about is on this phone. So this is a phone in Brandy Peters' bedroom. You'll be able to see, as the evidence is introduced, that the phone was ripped out of the phone jack, which appears there on the picture. The phone was ripped out of the phone jack, and in addition to being ripped out, the cord was also cut. And you'll see scuff marks along the wall here, which will be testified about by the defense reconstructionist, the former homicide investigator Michael Knox, indicating that there was a struggle over the phone and that the phone was ripped out of the wall at some point. So, and the reason I'm talking about the phone and why it's relevant is because this isn't just some surface. It's a surface that circumstantial evidence supports the notion there was an altercation right there over that phone. One of the people that Mr. Santos will tell you was involved in the commission of this murder is Angel Avila, a Colombian national. Mr. Avila was a big-time drug trafficker as well. He had been previously indicted by the federal government in a major drug trafficking operation. and was subsequently deported back to Colombia after he had his sentence reduced in 2009. What Dr. Dela Cruz will explain is that a lot of times when somebody testifies against a cartel or against their family, they're required to do something called wet work in order to clean their face. I'll use that expression again. Once they've testified against a cartel asset, a cartel member, that they may be required to do wet work in order to save their own lives. And so in this case, that's exactly what Mr. Avila was required to do. Mr. Avila's DNA, as it were, was found on that phone. So when Jo Ellen Brown from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement comes in and testifies, one of the things that she'll say is she developed a complex mixture of DNA from a swab of this phone cradle right here. The phone cradle that was fought over where the cord is ripped out of the wall and cut. One of the contributors to that mixture was Mr. Avila, as it ultimately turned out. Now, Jo Ellen Brown didn't do that testing. She was the one who developed the profile for comparison. Later, the government was able to obtain a buccal swab from Mr. Avila. A buccal swab is basically just where they take a cotton swab and stick it in somebody's mouth and get some saliva on it, and from that they can develop a DNA profile. And when that happened, the DNA profile was developed for Mr. Avila, and he was matched to the DNA found on that phone right there. In addition to the DNA found on the phone, there was foreign male DNA found on the shovel that was placed next to the victim's body. And you'll hear testimony throughout the trial talking about the difference between touch DNA and other forms of DNA that can be deposited by saliva or semen or, touching something, blood. All of those means are ways that blood can, or DNA rather, can be deposited on a particular item. So we've got DNA on the phone cradle that matches Mr. Avila. We've got foreign male DNA on the shovel placed next to the victim's body. Mr. Segura, by the way, is excluded as a contributor to the foreign male DNA found on the shovel. We also have foreign female DNA found under the victim's fingernail. And one of the things that you'll see is that Brandy Peters fought valiantly in this case for herself and for her children, to the point where all her knuckles are broken and bruised and her acrylic nails have been ripped off. And under those fingernails was found foreign female DNA. The reason that that's relevant is that Dr. Dela Cruz will tell you that a general cartel tactic is to send a female. If they're going to do a hit at somebody's house, they'll send a female to the door because they're less threatening and more likely to get access, and Mr. Santos will tell you that's what happened here, that a female was sent to the door. When Brandy saw the rest of the folks coming, that's when she ran inside. So we've got foreign female DNA under her fingernails as well. And then we've got foreign male DNA recovered at a cleanup scene. So Jack McLean Park, it's like a quarter mile from Brandy Peters' house. In one of the back pavilions, so when you go in Jack McLean Park, you can go kind of straight into the left where the pool is, basketball courts and the main bathhouse and all that. But you can also turn right and go way to the back of the park. And at the very back of the park, there's a bathhouse there as well. Outside that bathhouse was a trash can with contents that were set on fire. It was discovered about a week after the murder. Inside the trash can were some bloody latex gloves, 6 pairs. There were an empty shop towel box. There was a gallon of bleach. And then inside there were bloody paper towels in the toilet and on the floor. And ultimately, those items, as well as some bloody shirts that were found inside this trash can, were sent off to FDLE for testing. Diane Guzman, another FDLE analyst and expert, will testify that foreign male DNA, which excluded Mr. Segura, was found on those shirts. Finally, I want to talk just briefly about Mr. McElfresh. One of the things that Jo Ellen Brown and Jason Bundy, two Florida Department of Law Enforcement experts that will testify effectively as defense experts in this case, is the importance of blind testing, which is to say a scientist doesn't want to know a theory necessarily when they're going to do their analysis. They don't want their interpretation, and there is a lot of gray area in DNA interpretation that you'll hear about. They don't want their opinions to be influenced by knowledge of an investigative theory. In this case, what happened was Mr. McElfresh was retained by the state attorney's office way back at the beginning of the case, 2010, 2011, and he was sent all the material that was developed from all of the evidentiary exhibits that were developed. He went through, he looked at all the electropherograms, which are charts that you'll hear discussed and you'll see during the course of the trial. Basically, whenever a DNA sample is tested, it produces a document which shows something that looks kind of like an EKG with peaks all over it. And so Mr. McElfresh received all that information, and he was specifically asked to look at all of the complex mixtures and see whether he disagreed with any of Joe Ellen Brown's findings or to see whether he could do anything different. He never reported to anybody that he could do anything different with the swab of the bath bar. It wasn't until 2017 that when he was called up and specifically asked to look at the swab of the bath bar again to see if he could do something different, that he finally said, oh yes, you know what, as a matter of fact, Mr. Segura is included as a contributor to the swab of the bath bar. Now, one thing that I'll ask you to listen to carefully is that is partially true. Mr. Segura's DNA is on the bath bar. And the reason his DNA is on the bath bar is because his son's DNA is on the bath bar. Joe Ellen Brown will testify that Javante Segura is included as a contributor to the mixture on that bath bar. What that means is that because he's Mr. Segura's son and half his DNA comes from Mr. Segura, you're going to see a lot of numbers that pop up on that sample that are consistent with Mr. Segura. But because there's interrelated individuals contributing to the mixture, no determination at all can actually be made about Mr. Segura's contribution to that mixture. Joe Ellen Brown will tell you that. She's a Florida Department of Law Enforcement senior analyst, or now retired former Florida Department of Law Enforcement senior DNA analyst. Jason Bundy, a regional director for the Florida Department of Law Enforcement DNA supervisor, will tell you that as well, as will the defense expert Kevin Knoppinger. They all agree on the point that Mr. Segura cannot be determined to be a contributor to the DNA mixture found on the bath bar. Only Mr. McElfresh, who was hired by the state to come in and do extra work in this case, will testify to that finding. You're also going to hear a lot of testimony about the forensics in this case. And generally what I mean when I'm talking about forensics is crime scene processing. So that includes blood spatter analysis like we were talking about before, bullet trajectory analysis, interpretation of wounds, if there are any to be interpreted, and all of that. And so what you'll learn happened during the course of the testimony is that the altercation started in Brandy Peters' bedroom, which is this room over here. Mr. Knox will tell you that he knows that that's where the altercation started, at least where the violence started, because of the amount of blood deposited in the room. It's the smallest area of Miss Peters' blood present in the house. And then there are directional swipe marks as well as blood spatter pattern falling throughout the hallway as she comes towards the front of the house here, comes down the hallway, gets to the front door. There are directional swipe patterns on the door, again, Miss Peters' blood. Ultimately, she makes it out of the house. We know that she makes it out of the house as we go through each of these pictures. So there's blood from Miss Peters on the floor. There's a bullet fired in the bedroom that misses her and goes out the window. There's another bullet that's fired within her bedroom that travels into this hallway closet right here and is discovered there by law enforcement when they process the scene. And there are two more bullets found in the bedroom, in the bathroom attached to Miss Peters' bedroom. So just for reference, the two bullets that were found next to Miss Peters' bedroom in her bathroom are right in there. So like I said, eventually Miss Peters, you can see the swipe marks here, makes her way out of her bedroom, down the hallway. This is towards the front of the house here, depositing blood on the walls as she goes. You see blood spatter there on the walls. Mr. Knox will talk to you about the directionality of that blood spatter and what direction it indicates Miss Peters is moving. You'll also see indications that the struggle was ongoing. She was shedding jewelry as she went. There was an earring located on the floor in the hallway there. And we see, again, more transfer patterns as she makes her way towards the front of the house. Outside the house is blood spatter, which is impact spatter, indicating Miss Peters is being struck at that point outside the house. And there's blood spatter going in both directions. Back inside the house, you'll see from the blood spatter, and you'll hear testimony about the dynamic nature of the struggle. One of the things that Mr. Knox is going to tell you about is the fact that there are handprints on the walls, the fact that there's spatter going up both walls and all the way up to the ceiling is indicative of a moving crime scene, which is to say that the assailants are moving as well as Ms. Peters throughout the attack. One of the things that Mr. Knox is also going to tell you about is the shoe impressions that were found at the scene. And this is an important point, because the state's theory is and always has been that Mr. Segura committed this murder by himself. There's absolutely no evidence indicating that he did anything in concert with anybody else at any point relative to these murders. And so there were 5 separate shoe impressions, or potential shoe impressions, that were located in the blood around Ms. Peters' body. Highly relevant is that these shoe impressions are all different. So 5 distinct shoe impressions, not from the same shoes. All right, so that's indicative of 5 different people at least being involved here. Another thing that's highly relevant about that is that law enforcement was excluded by another Florida Department of Law Enforcement expert as having deposited the shoe impressions. So Greg Mion from Tampa, he's a FDLE footwear impression expert. He's going to come in and testify, whether the state calls him or the defense. He's effectively a defense expert, that there are 5 separate impressions and that law enforcement's shoe impression standards were excluded as having contributed to any of these. And again, it's important because it indicates clearly that multiple individuals were involved in the commission of the offense. Other evidence tending to indicate the same thing, that is that multiple individuals were involved in the commission of the offense, are the number of weapons used. So Mr. Knox will also testify that between the wound patterns exhibited on Ms. Peters and the impact spatter or blood spatter discovered at the house and photographed here, it's highly, highly unlikely, if not impossible, that a firearm could have created cast-off that high. And what that means, cast-off, is as a weapon is being swung and it's getting blood on it, when it goes back, it slings blood. And so what Mr. Knox is going to tell you is that in order for the blood to have been cast off at the height that it was cast off in this case, it would have required a longer item than a firearm. He says that most likely is something at least 2 feet long, like a crowbar or something to that effect. Besides the height of the cast off, as you see here, we're going to hear testimony and you'll see pictures of the different types of injuries that Ms. Peters sustained, and I hate to put these in front of you first thing in the morning, but of course they're highly relevant. Now, can it be determined, or will anybody testify with absolute certainty that all of these wounds were made by different weapons? No, but there's other evidence which indicates that that's true. So you have these crescent-shaped injuries here as one type of injury. You have a number of puncture wounds that are a different type of injury. You have a crush injury in the back where the skull is actually fractured. This is another picture of that same type of injury. There's an oval picture that I didn't, put the gruesomest angle in front of you here, but that's a totally different pattern from the other ones shown so far. And then directly on top of her head, there's a perfect circle, again, totally inconsistent with being deposited by a firearm, any part of a firearm, the barrel, the handle, anything. As you can see there, it's 4 centimeters in diameter, so it's roughly the size of the end of a baseball bat. Not that that's what it was, but that's more akin to the type of weapon that would have been used. And that's a close-up of the oval. You're also going to hear testimony throughout the case pertaining to the time of death. Now, Mr. Fuchs has already kind of conclusively stated that Ms. Peters died, between 6:53 and 7:37 when we see Mr. Segura texting. But that's not what the evidence actually indicates. It is true that her phone goes inactive and there are only passive events after 6:53, but we know that Ms. Peters was still alive when her phone died, when her phone ran out of juice. There's both circumstantial and direct evidence to support that notion. So one piece of evidence that supports the notion that Ms. Peters was still alive when her phone ran out of juice at 8:21 is that we know she ran for the landline. Now, obviously, if you go to a landline, when you're being attacked, you can't move around. You can't lock yourself in a bathroom. You can't lock yourself in a closet. And we know that she was going for the landline in this case because we saw scuff marks on the wall. The line was cut. The cord was pulled out of the phone jack. More relevantly, Ms. Peters' sister, Monica Peters, told Officer Jernigan from the Tallahassee Police Department the day after the murder that she last spoke to Ms. Peters at approximately 10 o'clock p.m. the night before, which would have been the 19th, indicating that she was still alive at 10 p.m., which you'll see as we get into the cell phone records, is a half an hour after Mr. Segura is home. She's still alive at 10 p.m. And there's not going to be a dispute about that, just to kind of give you a preemptive view of the testimony pertaining to cell phone towers and the information extracted therefrom. Both Sergeant Corbett for the Tallahassee Police Department and the defense cell expert John Sawicki will testify that Mr. Segura's handset traveled home back down to Woodville, and he was home by 9:31 p.m. and then remained down in Woodville for the remainder of the evening, active on his phone. He was texting back and forth with one of his girlfriends trying to set up a hookup for later that night. With respect to the time of death, what I will end up ultimately suggesting is the most compelling evidence of time of death comes from a combination of Dr. Flanagan and neighbor Marquise Davis's testimony. So Marquise Davis lives directly across the street from Brandy Peters at the time of the murder. Marquise Davis is friends with Brandy Peters, and at that time he's the live-in boyfriend of C.C. Timmons, whose name you already heard. C.C. Timmons was Miss Peters' best friend at the time. And Mr. Davis had a relationship not only with Brandy as a friend, but also with the children. It wasn't uncommon at all for him, since he was home most of the time, to make dinner for the kids. That would happen at least a couple of nights a week, that the two twin girls, Tamaya and Tanaya, as well as Javante, would eat dinner over at C.C. Timmons' house because they played with Miss Timmons and Mr. Davis' children. So Mr. Davis is going to testify. And again, it's relevant when Mr. Davis's testimony came to light because he did not voluntarily go talk to law enforcement following the murders, notwithstanding that he potentially had information that was relevant. That may be hard for some folks to understand, but what Mr. Davis will tell you when he testifies is that he's an African-American man on felony probation, and there are no circumstances when he's just going to go up and voluntarily speak to the police. So his testimony didn't come to light until the defense team found him in 2017. What he testifies to is that on the night of the murders, although the kids ate Burger King at 4 o'clock or so, he made them dinner, and they ate dinner around 7 o'clock at his house. He also sent a plate of food over to Brandy for her to eat as well. Mr. Segura was there at that time, and he will tell you that she ate that food as well. That's significant because when paired with Dr. Flanagan's testimony, Dr. Flanagan says the food in all 4 victims' stomachs was digested for about 3 hours as of the time of their death. That puts the victims alive till at minimum 10 o'clock, half an hour after we already know Mr. Segura is home and never leaves Woodville again for the rest of the night. We'll also hear testimony from Dahana Scott, who was the neighbor immediately adjacent to Brandy Peters' home. Ms. Scott will say, there is one other thing that's important to talk about with Mr. Davis before I move on to Ms. Scott. Mr. Davis, after feeding the children and sending a plate of food over to Ms. Peters' house for her to eat, he ended up taking a serving to his father across town. So he leaves his own house 7:30 or thereabouts, goes to his dad's house, takes him some oxtail soup, and then comes back. When he comes back, he sees there's a dark-colored SUV in the driveway. This is important because either that person is there killing Ms. Peters, or more likely, it's just a friend who's come to visit her. In any event, it indicates that she's still alive at that moment in time. If it was just a friend, obviously, who discovered the bodies, they would have reported it at that point in time, but no report was made. Now, with respect to Ms. Scott, Dahana Scott, the neighbor adjacent to Brandy Peters, when she got home from work at 10:50 or so, she noticed a white SUV in Brandy's driveway. At some point thereafter, perhaps around 11 o'clock, her dog starts going crazy like he never goes, right at Brandy's fence. So he's running back and forth, barking, going crazy, to the point that another neighbor, Darius Mount, who lives down the street from Brandy, comes outside, hears the dog. It's so out of the ordinary that he actually calls law enforcement sometimes in the early morning hours of November 20th. again, that's only circumstantial evidence, but it is actual evidence that you can pair with the scientific evidence from Ms. Flanagan and the testimonial evidence from Mr. Davis. You're also going to hear specific testimony from Mr. Segura about where he was and what he was doing throughout the day on the day of the murder. And you're going to see how the cell phone tower data corroborates everything that he says. So first, let's talk about, since we're going to get into the cell phone stuff and the evidence that you'll hear regarding the cell phone data, the Star 67 stuff, which Mr. Fuchs characterized as trying to hide his number or deceptive. What you'll see, if you want to go through all the records, and again, you'll get a big thick packet of phone records, every single time Mr. Segura calls Brandy Peters, every single time he Star 67s her from his girlfriend phone. And that's what this phone was, he'll tell you. He's, like I said, he'll take the stand and testify that he had the second phone because he was cheating on his wife with all these other women, at least 3 other ones during this time period. And he used that phone primarily to communicate with his girlfriends. The reason he didn't want Brandy having that number is because she's one of those people that blows your phone up if she has your number. She needs something or she wants something, she wants to get a hold of you. He didn't want to be getting 15 calls while he was with one of his other girlfriends. So he never let her know that number, although she knew it was him when he would call from that blocked number. That's why you see him talking to her for an extended period of time. So I referenced before that there was a text message from Brandy on Thursday, the day before the murders, wherein she says to him, hey, you know, you were looking good yesterday. If you weren't my baby daddy, I would have given you some. That starts a sequence of calls back and forth between Mr. Segura and Ms. Peters. Those calls go back and forth all throughout the day on Friday, which is, again, the date of the murder. And you'll see where Mr. Segura is, and he'll tell you where he was and what he was doing. Basically, his entire day, that day, is designed around going over to Ms. Peters' house and having sex with her. That was the plan that they had kind of come up with after they started talking and flirting and all this again. You see the text message on Friday that Mr. Fuchs referenced where she was asking if he hung up on her. He'll testify about that. It wasn't a hang-up. She was at school picking the twins up at that point and got cut off. He ended up calling back later. In any event, you'll see that he went over to her house around 1:30 or so. She wasn't home. He calls her. She's not there, so he goes over to his sister's house, Mr. Segura's own sister's house, Sean Segura, hangs out there for a little while. Brandy says in another later phone conversation that she should be home maybe around 3:30 after she picks the girls up. So Mr. Segura goes back and parks his vehicle around 3 o'clock at a church near Brandy's house. The reason he does that is because anytime he's hooking up with somebody, he's not going to park in their driveway because he's afraid his wife will find out. And again, he had made this promise to his wife that he wasn't going to cheat anymore, and he didn't want word getting back to her that he was, in fact, still cheating. So he goes over there. He has sex with Miss Peters. He uses a condom, which is why there's no semen or DNA evidence of that sort. And afterwards, he hangs out for a little while. Javante and the twins come back. They've eaten. They sit there and watch TV for a while. You see data use sessions during the 7 o'clock hour where he's on his phone checking email and things of that nature. And then ultimately he leaves. It appears that he leaves, based on his phone records, at about 8:21 p.m. I say 8:21 p.m. because at that point his phone is traveling back down, I think it's Paul Russell, towards South Monroe, so he can go back to Woodville. And that's where he stays for the rest of the night. Again, Sergeant Corbett and John Sawicki, the defense cell expert, will testify uniformly about that. That Mr. Segura's testimony is consistent with what the cell phone tower data shows. Now, Mr. Fuchs did make a point to indicate that Brandy's phone was inactive, from whatever time it was. I guess 6:53 was her last active communication, and then gets shut off or is out of juice at 8:21 p.m. However, we don't have her landline records still to this day. And again, remember that her sister said she talked to her at 10 o'clock p.m. Now, Mr. Segura did lie when he was interviewed by the police about being there at Brandy's house. I've already explained what his motivation for him not wanting to find his wife to find out that he was engaged still in extramarital affairs. One thing that I would ask you to keep your ears open for and pay attention to when you hear this testimony come out, Mr. Segura didn't tell any lies during his police interviews that were unique to Brandy, which is extraordinarily important. When he's asked about Natasha Hawthorne, another one of his girlfriends, he lies about her too and says that he's friends with her, that he's not hooking up with her. And Investigator Lewis kind of pokes him about that and asks about that, And no, she's just a friend. So he's not only lying about Brandy, he's lying about every woman with whom he's having an extramarital affair. And beyond that, you'll be able to see that when Mr. Segura is going through his interviews with law enforcement, Investigator Lewis starts to sense that this has something to do with him hooking up with Brandy. At one point, you'll see, because Mr. Fuchs is going to play the recorded interview with Mr. Segura, Mark Lewis asks him, is there something going on with you and Brandy? Look, I'm not the morals police. I don't care that you're married. He senses it, because like Mr. Fuchs says, he does this for a living. And he senses that Mr. Segura is not being honest, and he senses that it's about marital infidelity. And so he asked that question, but Mr. Segura says no. Ultimately, Malika Segura does find out, which is why you'll hear a jail phone call that the state has after Mr. Segura got arrested a year later, where he's saying, yeah, looks like I gave up my life for you, talking to his wife, Malika, indicating that he lied to try and protect their marriage from, the destructive information that ended up coming out, and their marriage ended as a result. You're also going to hear evidence from Investigator Lewis about Mr. Segura's lack of emotion. And Mr. Segura is going to talk about that to you. Like we talked about in jury selection, a lack of outward expression of emotion is not a lack of emotion. Look, Mr. Segura is a tough guy. He's a blue-collar guy. He's a tough guy. He'll tell you that when he was a kid, if he cried, his dad would punch him in the arm and tell him, men don't cry. And so that's not something he does. Even when his son, Jalik, died, he was a basket case, but he didn't cry about it, literally cry, because that's not a thing that he does. He buries it, and he tries to carry on. For lack of a better expression, he tries to be a man. That doesn't mean that he's got a lack of emotion. He'll tell you what he was feeling. He was feeling a lot of complicated things that were pulling him in multiple directions. He was doing the best that he could under the circumstances to do what he always does, which is be strong and soldier on. Part of the ambivalence about his feelings, or part of the mixed bag of feelings that he was going through, were guilt. He didn't have a firm idea of whether Javante was his son at that point, and so he hadn't been an involved dad like he had for his other out of wedlock children, like Janae. Every time he and Brandy would fight, she would tell him that Javante wasn't his kid, and he had actually filed paperwork to do a paternity test and see if Javante was in fact his son prior to the murders. So he was in the process of trying to determine that. He had a volatile relationship with Brandy, which impacted his emotions, of course, and didn't know for certain that Javante was his son. But that doesn't mean that he didn't feel emotions. He was reflecting a lot of the outward mood that Investigator Lewis was projecting, and so Mr. Segura was kind of mirroring that, And he'll tell you too, part of the thing is that he, as an African-American male, is generally uncomfortable talking to law enforcement anyway. And so that's another thing that was kind of playing into his attitude at the time. So just keep that in mind when you hear testimony from Investigator Lewis that's trying to, draw a connection between his apparent lack of emotion and, the profile, I suppose, of somebody who would commit this type of offense. Like Mr. Fuchs said, you will hear evidence that Mr. Segura had a .32, but this was months before the murders occurred in this case. What actually happened there is that in July, Mr. Segura was on a job and he got a call from a cousin of his, and he'll tell you about this when he testifies. His cousin had crossed some guys. I guess his cousin was a drug dealer or drug user or something, and he had crossed somebody up in Mississippi. So Mr. Segura, since he was on his way back from a job anyway, stopped in Mississippi. He usually carries a firearm with him legally when he's on these jobs, because he's around drug users that serve as laborers on these contract jobs all the time, all over the country. And so he'll usually have a firearm on him, and in this specific instance, he had a firearm on him. It was a .32. And what happened was, when Mr. Segura got to Mississippi and was dealing with his cousin, at some point, the guys with whom the beef existed came to where they were. They pulled a firearm. He pulled his firearm in self-defense. They shot at him, and he was shot. He shot back. After that occurred, he got rid of the gun because he was involved in a shooting, and then went and got treatment. He was still recovering from that gunshot wound at the time of the murders in this case. So when Mr. Fuchs talks about him being a big, strong guy capable of exerting superhuman strength, just keep that in mind, that he hadn't even returned to full work yet because he was shot in the abdomen and the bullet traveled through his abdomen and finally lodged down in his groin. there are medical records that the defense may introduce to show you that as well. Lastly, when you're talking about the evidence that's going to come out in a case like this, it's important to keep in mind a lack of evidence as well. So important pieces of evidence that are missing include evidence of blood transfer and evidence of injuries. Mr. Knox is going to tell you that these offenses were incredibly violent. This was a very dynamic crime scene, again. And you'll see from the wounds to Ms. Peters' hands that she fought back. Her knuckles are broken here. Her fingernails are ripped off. You see one of her acrylic nails on the floor right here. These knuckles are all bruised and swollen. Same thing here. Mr. Segura, however, this is a picture taken the day after the murder, has no cuts, no scratches, no nothing on him. The only thing that he had was, you'll see down here, you can barely see it, of course, he had a tiny little scratch because when he went down to Silas Thornton's house the day after the murders on November 20th, they were shooting arrows in Mr. Thornton's backyard. Mr. Segura fired one past the target and had to go into a picker bush to get it back. That's the only scratch he had on his entire body. That's it. Additionally, you'll hear testimony from Mr. Knox pertaining to the fact that there would have been, the person or people who were involved in the commission of these offenses would have been covered in blood because of the saturation, because of the spatter that occurred while the wounds were being struck. And there is no blood transfer in any of Mr. Segura's vehicles. All his vehicles are messy, so it's not like they've been cleaned up. You'll see pictures of them. There's no blood found anywhere that ties him to the victim. There's no, blood on clothes that they find at his house. There's no gloves with blood relevant to the crime that they find at his house. So just keep in mind those important pieces of missing evidence as well as we go through. I know I've just kind of thrown a lot at you, but I wanted to give you a thorough preview of what I expect the evidence to be so that you can, number one, be aware of what's coming and think about ahead of time how all that evidence fits together. And at the end of the day, if you follow the instructions of the court, which require you to return a not guilty verdict in the event that the state fails to prove beyond and to the exclusion of every reasonable doubt, which again is any doubt which is not speculative or imaginary, that is based on evidence, you'll find Mr. Segura at long last not guilty of these offenses.
Let's take 10 minutes. Let the jury step out with the deputy. Either side, anything?
No, they are.
All right, have your first witness in the courtroom when we resume, Mr. Hughes.
They are.
All right.
Did you need to say you needed to delay something from this? No.
I didn't want them on.
Is that where you want? Pretty much.
I'm gonna move it forward just a little bit. There we go.
You walk around here.
Yeah, I got it. Good lunch. Yeah.
Sure. Any questions?
Yeah.
I don't have a watch. Yeah. You don't have to talk right into it because it's very sensitive, but yeah, you gotta keep your voice up. Okay. But you don't have to bend over the water, just keep your voice up.
Okay.
Please introduce yourself to the jurors.
Artron Timmons. I live across the street.
All right, and Mr. Timmons, how do you spell your name?
Artron, last name Timmons, Timmons.
And Mr. Timmons, you said you lived across the street. We're talking about back in November of 2010, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And where was that? Where did you live at that time?
901 Sutter Creek Run.
Where is that in Tallahassee?
South side by Jim Lee Road and behind Fairview.
Okay. Over there by the fairgrounds and stuff as well, Capitol
Yes, sir.
Stadium and all that?
Yes, sir.
Okay. You said you lived across the street. Do you know Brandy Peters?
Yes, sir.
How do you know Miss Peters?
Her and my mama was friends, neighborhood.
Your Honor, can I approach the witness?
You may.
Showing you some previously marked State's Exhibit number 1. Who is that?
Brandy Peters.
That's Brandy Peters?
Yes, sir.
Your Honor, this time is State's Exhibit number 1 in evidence, please.
Any objection? Be admitted.
Permission to publish?
You may.
Did Miss Peters have any children?
Yes, sir.
Did she have any boys or girls?
Both.
Okay. Did you get to meet the girls?
Yes, sir.
What was the girl's name?
Tamaya and Tanaya.
Showing previously marked State's Exhibit number 2 for identification purposes. Do you recognize them?
Yes, sir.
Who's that?
Tamaya and Tanaya.
Okay. Your Honor, I move State's Exhibit number 2 in evidence, please.
Any objection? Be admitted.
Permission to publish?
You may.
Now the twins, which one's which?
Man, it's hard. It's hard.
It's hard,
been a
it's
long
hard,
time.
right?
Yeah.
How old were you back in November 2010?
2010, I had to be like 14. Yes, sir, 14.
14 years old. Okay. All right. Now you said you had a little boy?
Yeah.
Okay. What was his name?
Javante.
Showing from previously marked State's Exhibit number 3 for identification purposes. You recognize that?
Yes, sir.
Who's that?
That's Javante.
That's Javante? Your Honor, move State's Exhibit number 3 in evidence, please.
Any objection? Be admitted.
Permission to publish?
You may.
Now you mentioned that your mom and Brandy were friends.
Yes, sir.
Were you living with your mom at that time?
Yes, sir.
Who else you live with?
My stepfather,
What's his name?
Marquise Davis.
Okay. On the morning of November 20th, were you asked to go over to Brandy's house?
Yes, sir.
Why?
Because her mom had been texting my mama, trying to get in contact with her or something like that. I know they was trying to get a hold of her.
Was your mom home at the time?
Nah, she was at work.
All right, so she called you?
Yes, sir. I had stayed home from school. Well, no, I think that was a Saturday, wasn't it? Wasn't it the weekend?
I think it's up to, you're the witness. You tell me.
Yeah, I don't really remember if it was the weekend or not, but I remember like she called me early that morning, like she called the house phone, and she was like, go over there and tell Brandy to call her mama, cause nobody get in contact with her. I'm like, all right, that ain't nothing.
Okay. Did you go over there?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And when you went over, you live, how far away were you? How far away do y'all live?
To be exact, it was a corner right there on the corner. I live right there across the street and 2 houses down. Well, yeah, 3 houses down.
3 houses down, but across the street as well.
Yes, sir.
So a pretty short distance there.
Yeah, like straight diagonal. Like I walk out my front door, I see her front door.
Okay. Did you go over to her house?
Yes, sir.
When you got to her house, what did you do?
Well, I tried to ring the doorbell, but the doorbell was busting. I seen blood, and I'm knocking on the door. I'm thinking like, oh,
Let me stop you right there. You said the doorbell was busted?
Yes, sir.
What do you mean it was busted? It was broken off or just wasn't working?
It wasn't. It was like pushed in.
Okay.
Like you can't ring it.
Okay. And you said you saw something, blood?
Blood.
Where'd you see blood at?
I saw it like as I was walking up. I saw it like drops. Like I'm thinking like a kid hurt himself, but then I look up. It's on the curtains. It's like everywhere. Like on the inside, you can see like it was like blood.
All right, approach.
You may.
showing you photographs, it's been marked previously as composite 5A and B. Take a look at those photographs real quick.
Yeah.
Are those photographs of the house?
Yes, sir.
Brandy Peters' house?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Your Honor, move states composite 5A and B in evidence.
Any objection?
No.
Be admitted.
Permission to publish?
You may.
Now, I'm going to guess that the crime scene photos, the yellow tape and stuff like that, that wasn't there when you walked up, correct?
No.
Okay. But that's her front of her house?
Yes, sir.
Again, crime scene tape wasn't there, but is that also the front door of her house?
Yes, sir.
I noticed this window appears to be broken out in this photograph. Was it broken out when you walked out there?
No, sir.
Okay, that window was intact?
Huh?
That window was there?
Yeah, it was intact.
Okay, all right. So you walked up, doorbell doesn't work, see blood, what'd you do next?
Knocked on the door. I mean, like, I still did it. Like, knocked on the door. You know, I'm young.
You knocked on the door?
Yeah.
Okay,
Like,
anybody answer?
No.
What happened next?
Went home, called my mama, told her I seen blood. She told me to call the police.
Did you call the police?
Yes, sir.
Law enforcement respond?
Yes, sir.
Now I'm gonna ask you, when's the last time you saw Brandy? Before that?
I don't remember.
What about the kids?
The day before.
Okay, who'd you see? I mean, there's three kids, Tamaya, Tanai, and Javante. Do you remember who you saw?
All three of them.
Okay, where'd you see them at?
In between our houses, well, in between my neighbor house. Oh, yeah, my house and my neighbor house.
Okay, so right there by your house.
Yes, sir.
What were they doing? Do you remember what time it was?
They was playing and they had to be around 5 or 6 o'clock because I went to school and I got to school at 3:50 and I used to always get home late. And that was a long walk because my bus stop was at the top of Jim Lee Road. So it had to be around like between 5 and 6.
That's the normal time you get home?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And what were they doing?
Playing, like always. It was just like a regular day.
Okay. Did you see anything in their hand or around them regarding food?
Yeah, it was some rappers, it was some Burger King rappers and whatnot. Cause I remember when I went in the house, my mama had done came outside and she had done seen it and she was like, oh, like, you know, like these kids got all this trash in the yard or whatever. So
it's not normal to have trash in the yard?
I mean, it's normal to have trash in the yard, but you know, it was just like, you know how it is.
Unfortunately, you have to tell the jury what it's like.
It's like, okay, you know, like it's something in your yard, it's like, dang, it's trash in my yard. You know, like,
Okay.
that situation.
And the trash you're talking about is the Burger King trash?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so somebody made exception to the fact there was new Burger King trash in the yard, is what you're saying?
Yes, sir.
Didn't like it.
Yeah.
So is that why the Burger King stood out to you, the trash?
No, it's just, like, I remember, like, that was something my mama had said. Like, them kids need to get that trash up. Like, they out there playing, they need to get that trash up.
Okay. But there's new Burger King.
Yeah, trash, yeah.
Okay. At some point, were you asked to go back to their house and get them or anything along those lines?
Yes, sir, I was asked to get them cut my stuff out. I had them cook, some oxtails, and some more stuff, but...
Do you remember when that was?
Not really. I know it was like the day before, but I don't remember like the exact time. I had to be out of school, you know, but...
Okay. All right, so it was after you came home and you told the other, what time y'all normally eat dinner?
I don't remember.
Okay.
It wasn't like a set time. It was like whenever the food got done. Whenever the food got done, we finna eat.
Was it earlier in the evening, closer to when you got home then?
A little bit after.
A little bit?
Yeah.
Within, say, an hour?
Yeah.
So roughly an hour after you got home, you're asked to go over there and get them?
Yes, sir.
So somewhere between 6 and 7 o'clock?
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Do you eat oxtail soup?
I don't like oxtails.
Okay. Did you go get the kids?
I think so.
Did you get all of them, or just one, or all three of them come?
I don't think all of them came. I think it was just one of the girls. I told one of the girls to to the rest of them, I don't really remember, like, for sure.
Okay. But you didn't sit down and eat with them or know whether they ate or not?
No. I was a loner. I'm a lonely child.
Okay. All right. You talked to law enforcement after they responded and told them all this?
Yes, sir.
One moment. No further questions.
Cross.
Gentlemen, I approach for just a moment.
What's that?
May we approach for just a moment?
Sidebar?
Yes, sir.
May proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Timmons, I just wanted to clarify one issue. In earlier court proceedings, you wouldn't appear voluntarily. The state had to secure a material witness warrant for you, correct?
Yes, sir.
And that was because you were afraid.
Yes, sir.
And to be clear, it was not because you were afraid of Mr. Segura or anybody connected to Mr. Segura.
That is correct.
No further questions.
Redirect.
Let's be clear, you're a little younger back then, correct?
Yeah.
You're here today, you're actually living where now?
North Dakota.
North Dakota?
Yes, sir.
Came down voluntarily?
Yes, sir.
You're under subpoena, of course, but you came down voluntarily?
Yes, sir.
No questions, no issues?
No, sir.
All right.
Any juror have a question of this witness? All right. If not, you can step down. Do we need to keep him any further?
No, Your Honor.
Need him for any reason, Mr. Prince?
Not that I anticipate, but I would ask that he remain subject to the rule and under subpoena and go about his business.
Well, when was he planning to return to North Dakota?
I honestly don't know what his flight plans are.
Yeah, I don't want to, unless you have, do you know when you were planning to leave?
Yes, sir. On the 12th.
The 12th? Okay, you're going to stay here anyway till then?
Yes, sir.
Okay, remain till then, and let the attorneys know how to contact you. Call you next witness.
Your Honor, this time state will call Officer Jernigan.
But hearing everything okay, I know we had Mr. Fuchs' mic a little over revved there, but I think we got that sorted. Other than that, are y'all hearing things okay? Like I say, we're at a new sound system. We're kind of trying to get it adjusted. It's not a new system, new controls, so trying to get it a little bit adjusted here. If you face the clerk and be sworn, please.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you give in this case will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
May I proceed, Mr. Fuchs?
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning.
Good morning.
Can you please introduce yourself to the jury?
Officer Jernigan with the Tallahassee Police Department.
And your first name is?
Candace.
And can you please spell your first and last name for Madam Reporter, please?
It's CANDICE-JERNIGAN.
And you're an officer with the Tallahassee Police Department?
Yes, sir.
How long have you been an officer with them?
Going on 16 years.
16 years. What are your
TPD.
duties normally as a Tallahassee police officer?
I'm in the field training division, so I'm a field training officer. I'm on patrol, which is on the south side of town.
Back in November of 2010, what were your duties in?
I was on patrol, south side of town, southeast particularly.
By being on patrol, what does that entail?
Calls for service, proactive work. Generally, dispatch will send us a call, we'll respond, or if we come across something in the field, proactively, traffic stops, things like that, we'll address those.
And back in 2010, would you have been in uniform, Tallahassee police officer uniform,
Yes,
similar
sir.
to what you're wearing now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Were you in a marked unit?
Yes, sir.
I know cars have changed a lot since then.
Yes, they have.
Like back then it was the white and blue with the lights and
Yes.
everything like that. Okay. Back in November 20th, 2010, in the morning hours, did you have an occasion to respond to Saddle Creek Run?
I did.
Do you remember what time it was that you responded?
It's around 10 in the morning, a little after.
And where did you respond to?
908 Saddle Creek Run.
Was that here in Leon County?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Whenever you first responded, at that time, were you, I know you talked about field training officer, at that time, is it one officer in a car or two officers? Were you working
One
in there?
officer.
Okay, so one officer per car,
Yes, sir. Mhm.
When you responded to Saddle Creek Run, were you alone?
I was alone.
Okay. What did you do when you first got there?
I went to the intersection of Jim Lee and Saddle Creek Run and made contact with the complainants or the callers that called initially,
Okay.
TPD.
And I assume they briefed you about what was going on?
Yes, sir.
What did you do next?
They had mentioned, they had pointed out the house, 908 Saddle Creek Run, and I observed that there was blood on the exterior of the house. And so I also observed there was a car in the yard of 908 Saddle Creek Run. There were kids playing in the car. So I made a point to remove the kids and get help in trying to keep citizens back from the house just based on the outside appearances that something might have occurred inside.
Okay. So why was it important to remove the kids, but not the car, but also maintain the security that you're talking about?
Because there was a large amount of blood on the exterior, on the garage and on the front door. So it was obvious to me in my training experience something bad had happened or was happening still in the house. And my concern was for the children. And in case there was someone dangerous inside or something still occurring, I didn't want them to be hurt. Or the citizens that were, onlookers had started to gather. So I wanted to make sure they were all back as far as I could on my own. So
At that point, were you still alone, or had you been joined by other officers?
I was still in.
Okay. What did you do next?
Once I was able to get the kids out of the car and out of the front yard, then I approached carefully with my firearm out and went towards the front of the house and tried to listen for anything that was actively occurring or see if I could see anything through the front.
Were there any signs that anything was occurring actively?
No.
You said you tried to see something through the front. What was it you're trying to
The
do?
curtains were closed, and then I started making my way out, and again, I was asking for backup and emergency traffic, and which means clearing the radio so that I could speak just based on the situation that something may have happened or be happening. And then I started making my way around the house to check around the house.
Okay. What happened next?
I started on the house faces south. So I started on the east side of the house. So if I was facing the house, the right side of the house, started going alongside and looking at the windows, trying to pay attention to noises if I heard anything going on inside the house. Made my way to the back because one of the complainants had mentioned seeing a body through the back door, through the window of the back door.
Okay. Did you eventually make a circuit around the entire house?
I went to the back, looked through the window, saw the body or the leg, and then
Well, let me stop you right there. You say you looked through the back window?
the back door, bottom of the back door, had a glass partition.
Okay. So the door wasn't open?
Door
closed.
was not open, it was locked.
Okay. And you looked through there and you saw, what was it?
A leg, a human leg, sticking out, laying on the floor. sticking out from behind a couch.
Your training experience, did that stand out to you?
Yes, obviously, I thought somebody was hurt or had been hurt. The leg wasn't moving, appeared still.
What'd you do next?
Then of course, I'm still transmitting on the radio, trying to get somebody en route to back me up. And then I looked around the west side of the house to see if there were any broken windows or anything that would indicate something, immediate, some forcible entry, and there wasn't. So I made my way back around the back and the east side of the house and took cover because I had backup that was a couple minutes away, it sounded like, and waited for them to get there.
So in your circuit around the house and your observations, did you see any signs of forced entry?
No. I noticed a screen that was a little wonky, but the window was closed and appeared secured, and I didn't notice anything else.
And just for clarification, what were we talking about forced entry?
Forced entry, broken glass, obvious, broken door hinge, as in kicked in or what have you, broken windows, windows ajar, doors ajar, anything like that, and I didn't notice that.
All right. Did you, you mentioned the back door was locked. Did you try the front door?
Eventually, yes.
Okay. Was the front door locked?
Yes.
Okay, so both front and back door locked, no sign of forced entry?
Yes.
No broken windows?
No broken anything.
All right, so you take cover, waiting for backup.
Yes.
If you've seen the leg and obviously what that signified to you, why are you waiting for backup versus trying to gain entry yourself right then?
Again, it was still the exterior and everything. I would be better off having another officer there because if I go in and get killed, then nobody's getting, I'm not laughing, but we're not getting anything done. And I had backup that was about to me based on the radio traffic. So I just took cover for a second, and then when they got to me, we approached the door and then tried to get in.
So that's part of your, if I understand you correctly, that's part of your training experience then, to wait for backup if it's readily available?
If something's actively occurring and we can tell that it's occurring and it's in progress, yelling or what have you, then I would have been forced to go inside and address the issue. It appeared, especially the blood on the outside of the house appeared dried, and it appeared that whatever had occurred some time ago.
Okay. So you said backup was en route. Did
Yes.
the backup arrive?
Yes.
Who was that?
Officer Kidd, Derek Kidd.
Okay. When Officer Kidd arrived, what did you do next?
We approached the front door. I tried kicking in the door, and that was well, first we tried the doorknob to see if we could get in. The curtains were bloody, and I'd already seen that, but I tried kicking the front door, couldn't open it, or that didn't work. So we tried the door handle, it was locked. And Officer Kidd, finally, there was a window on the right side or the east side of the door, so Officer Kidd used his baton to break the window open.
Showing as the previously introduced in the evidence based composite 5B, indicating a photo of the house. Appears to be a broken window on the right-hand side of the doorway. Is that the window you're referring to?
Yes.
So Officer Kidd broke that with his baton?
Yes.
So what happened next?
So he reached in, like I said, the door was locked. He reached in and the bolt and I believe the handle also were both locked, opened those. And then we called out, or I peeked in there and called out to anyone inside to make any noise or what have you.
Did anybody respond?
Nobody responded.
Okay. So what happened next?
I observed a female body lying in the front room.
Now at this point, are you inside the home or are you still outside the home?
Outside looking in.
Okay. Have you been able to open the door, or are you looking through that window we talked about?
I think initially and it was all happening very fast, but I peeked through the window and saw the female on the floor.
Okay. At some point, were you joined by Officer Wyman?
Yes.
Okay. Well, let me back up then. So you've looked in, you see the female lying by the door. What happened next?
Then we entered, Officer Kidd and I entered the front room to do kind of an initial protective sweep, which is we're clearing the front immediately accessible rooms to make sure there were no suspects or victims inside the kitchen and the main room.
And at this point, it's still you and Officer Kidd?
Yes, sir, and Wyman was almost to us, so
Joined
we
shortly
waited
thereafter?
a second for him.
Okay. In clearing a house, how do you go about doing that?
It depends on how many people we have, but there are certain standards. Like if there's an open door, we check that door first. If it's a closed door, we, watch the closed door to make sure it doesn't open. But we have certain standards in accordance with that. But we do a protective sweep, so we're looking for bodies. We're looking for any suspects or any place that a person can hide. So we check the main room, we check the kitchen, and then we move our way to the back, and it's systematic, and we just check each room and what have you until we clear the whole house.
And you mentioned you're looking for bodies, but you're also looking for persons that are alive.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, that's the main thing, suspects.
I'm sorry?
Yes.
Okay. The purpose of this, is it to collect evidence and find evidence and things along those lines?
No.
Okay. So what is the purpose of doing this protective sweep you're talking about?
It's safety. It's to make sure there's nobody hurt or injured and that there are no more suspects in the house.
Okay. And what was your role in clearing this particular house?
I was the third person back, so I was watching behind us while assisting with the clearing.
Okay. So you're the third person back, so at this point, Officer Wyman's already arrived and he's assisting with the clearing?
Yes. Officer Kidd's in the middle and Officer Wyman's in the front.
Okay. What'd you see?
We went down the hallway, and as we were going down the hallway, we cleared the bathroom, which was on our right, for walking north, it was on the right, and we saw some bodies in the bathtub, and then we cleared the rest of the house, and we cleared, meaning we didn't find anybody else in the house, suspects or otherwise, but, yeah.
You said there are bodies in the bathtub. Do you go up and actually physically move them or do any kind of real inspection in the situation?
We kept clearing the house.
After you cleared the house, what did you do next?
We went outside and just made sure that the scene was secure so that no one else could enter or what have you until we got the appropriate agency, like forensics and investigators down.
Investigators, talking about the criminal investigation
Yes, sir.
division?
Yeah.
And crime scene, talking about forensic specialists that
Yes,
actually
sir.
do the analysis, or not the analysis necessarily, but the collection of evidence and things like that. Is that
Yes,
correct?
sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
You see a lot of the yellow tape here. Is that y'all doing that, or other officers that are involved in trying to secure the scene? Is that part of that security?
Other
team?
officers that had arrived, by then.
So when you say securing the scene, you're trying to make sure those people you talked about earlier aren't coming into the house, backing them up, and then eventually it's roped off, I guess?
Yes, basically the house and everything in it was evidence. So we didn't want people walking in and out and destroying the evidence. We wanted to secure it so no one else could get in besides the people, the investigators and the forensics technicians that would need to be inside conducting the investigation.
And I'm showing you things, Exhibit 5A. You had mentioned a car that was in the front. Is that the car we're talking about?
Yes, sir.
That's the one with the kids in it?
Yes, sir.
And is all of that as it was whenever you approached the house?
Yes, sir.
Cross. All right, any juror have a question of this witness? All right, you can step down. You want to keep her subject to recall? All right, you'll be subject to recall. Call your next witness.
I'll take a call, Sean Wyman.
If you face the clerk and be sworn, please, sir.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you give in this case will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, ma'am, I do.
Have a seat. Slide up the rail, please. May I proceed?
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Can you please introduce yourself to the jurors?
Yes, hello. My name is Sean Wyman. I'm a police officer with Tallahassee Police Department.
And Officer Wyman, how long have you been with the Tallahassee Police Department?
It'll be 20 years, January 3rd.
Happy anniversary almost.
Almost. Yes, sir.
Prior to joining with the Tallahassee Police Department, were you employed with any other law enforcement agency?
No, sir. This is my first one.
Okay. Now, were you working back on November 20th of 2010?
Yes, sir, I was.
On that morning, did you have an occasion to respond to 908 Saddle Creek Run?
Yes, sir, I did.
And we heard from Officer Jernigan. My understanding is you were there to respond for backup for an ongoing event.
Yes, sir.
When you arrived, what did you first see?
When I first got there, the front door was open. There was a woman that was laying right there in front of the door on the inside, and there was a lot of blood along the walls. I saw a shovel, as I remember seeing like a small red shovel there, and then of course I saw Officer Jernigan and Officer Kidd, who were posted right there at the hallway.
What does that mean, posted?
Like they were set up there waiting for another officer to get there to clear the house.
Okay. When we say clear the house, what are you talking about?
I'm talking about making sure that we make sure that that there's nobody inside the residence as far as any, somebody who bad person or somebody who's hurt or injured inside the house somewhere.
Okay. And did you join them in clearing the house?
I did.
Okay. What was your role in that clearing?
So my role became the primary, or what they would call the point person, because I had been on an entry team for the Tactical Apprehension Control Team for 5 years, and I was currently a canine handler at the time. So I had a lot of tactical experience, as well as military background prior to going into law enforcement. So based on the officers that were there, I had the most experience, so I took that position.
As my understanding, you actually trained as an Army Ranger back in prior to going to law enforcement?
Yes, sir, I was.
Okay. So you're law enforcement, former Army Ranger, tactical team, and most experienced at that time. So you took point.
Yes, sir.
What is point?
So point is the lead person going down that hallway.
Okay. And as I understand it, clearing it for purpose of making sure that there's no suspects present still or nobody in need of medical assistance, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right, so walk us through what happened.
So, like I said, I take the lead. We start down the hallway. There's a door immediately to the right that leads into a bathroom. I remember that it was really dark when I went in. I flipped the light switch. I walk in. There's a bathtub basically right there in front of me, and I'll never forget. I saw two deceased juveniles in the tub, and it's not. The part that I remember the most was that I saw them, I called it on the radio, and then I immediately just walked back out like it was nothing, because I was in this mode of need to make sure that there's nobody in the house that's going to hurt us or hurt anybody else, and make sure that there's nobody else that's actually hurt.
You say you didn't react. I mean, I know there's no visual reaction when you're talking about, but you're trying to perform your duties still
Yes, sir.
in clearing the house.
Yes, sir.
So you're focused on that. That's where your focus was. Is that
Right.
correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So you see two juveniles in the bath,
Yes,
appear
sir.
to be deceased, and you continue clearing.
Yes, sir.
All right, walk us through that.
So we come out of the bathroom, and then we continue to clear the other rooms. I believe there were 3 bedrooms, if I remember right. So we clear all the rooms. We make sure that nobody else is inside the residence. And then once we get done doing that, then we start trying to figure out, okay, we know we got more resources that are going to be coming with this scene. We need to figure out what's the best way to keep from contaminating this scene. So that's what we started focusing on.
Okay. And when you say keep him from contaminating the scene, what are you talking about?
I'm talking about touching tampering or messing with any type of evidence that could be there. Just basically leaving everything as it is, not touching anything, not messing with anything. We verified that nobody was inside the house, that there was no concerns of anybody else that was injured inside the house, so it was time to back out, secure it, and wait for the proper resources to come in and do what they need to do.
While you're waiting for the other resources, we're talking about criminal investigative division, which investigators as well as crime scene, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Supervisors probably as well, if I had to make
Yes,
a
sir.
guess. Okay. Did you become aware of a possible third child that was missing?
I did. It was actually after the scene was secured, and we were now in a position where we were told to go and start talking to people in the neighborhood. And I was standing there on the street, and a woman approached me and said, "Have you, did you find my daughter? Have you seen my grandkids?" And then she, through her, she was explaining to me that there should have been 3 grandkids, and I was realizing that we had only found 2.
Okay. So did you take any steps to try and locate the third?
I did. I went to Sergeant Ormerod at that point. I said, "Hey, I got a witness who's saying that there should be 3 kids. I don't know. I didn't see them. Only ones I saw were the 2, but there's a possibility maybe that the third one could have been in the tub, and I just didn't see it." And so at that point, I was assigned to go back in with a forensic specialist to go in back into that bathroom and verify that the third one was in there.
So you, again, entered the home, walked through the home, and went to verify whether the child was there or not in the bathroom.
Yes, sir.
Did you find that child?
Yes, sir.
During the course of securing this scene and all your steps that were taken there, did you try and establish a way of getting in and out of the house for you in the crime scene that wasn't utilizing the front door?
I did. I determined that the garage was the best pathway to come in and out, and then at least until we had everything set up. So we made the decision to use the garage as the exit point to come out.
Why?
It just seemed to be the least contaminated out of everything that we had dealt with. We knew that we had children in the bathtub, and we didn't want to go down that hallway, and we also had the woman that was laying in the front door, so we definitely didn't want to keep walking in and out through the front door and like I said, trying to, stepping in stuff or messing with things that didn't need to be messed with.
Around this time of the state photographs, composite 6A through N into evidence.
Any objection? Be admitted.
First, I'm going to show you, Mr. Wyman, 6A, or Officer Wyman. 6A, what are we looking at here?
That's the garage to the house. That's on the, if I remember right, it's on the east side of the house.
Okay. Was that garage door open when you arrived like it is there?
No, I don't believe it was. I believe it was closed.
Okay. And would that be the steps that y'all took to get that egress and ingress
Yes, sir.
area?
That's
6B?
That's the inside of the garage, and then that's the doorway that leads into the kitchen dining area, if I remember right.
6C?
I believe that's once you come in from the garage, the kitchen area.
And then 6D appears to be another angle of the same.
Yes, sir.
6E kind of looks to be like it's facing the opposite direction.
Yes, sir. That's now looking back into the living room towards the west. You're going to have the hallway that's down to the right, if you make a right, and then the front door entrance. Oh, I'm sorry.
Top button.
Oh, I apologize. So if I'm going this way, I'm going down the hallway. If I'm going this way, that's going to be the front door or the entryway.
Okay. And this doorway right here is what?
I believe that's the garage. That's the way that we use to get in and out.
And this is where we can first see that's the female that was found, correct?
Yes, sir.
So this is going to be the front door area?
Yes, sir.
6F?
That's the living room, and of course the deceased is going to be back over on this side over here by the front door, and then this is the right here is where Officer Jernigan and Officer Kidd were posted up waiting for me when I got here, and then this is going to be the hallway that we go down.
6G?
That's the main living room area. And again, if you go to the right, it's going to be where the entryway is back over on this side over here. And then the hallway is going to be back on this side over here.
So this is kind of a previous table, I guess countertop that's all, this would be looking straight out into the living room.
Yes, sir.
Countertop.
Yes, sir.
6H,
So 6H is going to be where the entryway was. This is where we initially, all of us, came in at. Had to step over the woman here and go get this way to get to the hallway.
so upon entry, you, Officer Kidd, Officer Jernigan would have had to step across here and over her essentially to gain entry.
Yes, I don't know exactly how I know that they came through the front door. I don't know which way they stepped. I know for me, I tried to step around the head side and come through that way.
Around
Right
this
there.
area?
Yes, sir.
6I.
I believe that's going to also, that's the living room area as well. That's a plant that was knocked over. That's going to be the front door. That's the legs of the woman. So the front door is going to be right here, and then this is the living room area here.
6J appears to be, again, we're talking about the garage door here?
Yes, sir.
Correct, and then the front entryway.
Yes, sir.
6K.
Yeah, thanks for turning that.
Yeah,
That's, no, that's okay. That's the hallway, and this is the very first room that we went into right here, the bathroom.
You mentioned bedrooms going down. This appears to be a doorway right here. Is that one of the bedrooms?
I believe so. Again, I don't remember exactly how the bedrooms were positioned, but yeah, I believe this is a bedroom, this is a bedroom. I thought there was one more deep, and if I'm not mistaken, this is the exit out the back, which would have been the north side of the residence into the backyard.
And 6L.
Yes, sir. That's the bathroom that we walked into and what we saw when we walked in.
6M. The children.
Yes, sir.
It appears to be 3 of them visible at this point. Did you have to manipulate one of them in order to?
Did not. Just the first time, I didn't see it. I mean, it was quick. I saw what I saw. We didn't manipulate anything when we went back in.
Okay. All right. And then finally, 6N, I think it is, back of the residence.
Yes, sir.
And that's that back door that you previously pointed out.
Yes, sir.
No further questions.
Cross? All right, any juror have a question of this witness? All right, write your question down, we'll go sidebar. And were you able to determine whether the back door was locked?
It's a great question, and I'll be honest with you, I do not recall if it was locked or if it wasn't. I want to say it was locked, but I can't tell you. That's a great question, but I really don't know the answer 100%. I want to say it was locked because I know when we did the securing the crime scene and when we got other officers there and there were people in the backyard and stuff, I want to say it was locked, but I honestly don't remember.
Any further, Mr.
There you are.
Prince? All right, you can step down.
Thank you, Your Honor.
We need to keep this witness further.
If we retain your honor, we can go about it.
All right, be subject to recall.
Yes, sir.
Call your next witness.
All right, let's have a table call here for the problem.
You'd face the clerk and be sworn, please, ma'am.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you give in this case will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Have a seat. Slide up the rail, please, ma'am. May proceed, Mr. Hughes.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning.
Morning.
Can you please introduce yourself to the jurors?
Sure. My name is Lieutenant April DeBrava Wilder.
Okay, and can you please spell your first and last name for Madam Reporter?
My first name is April, A-P-R-I-L. Last name is DeBrava, D-O-U-B-R-A-V-A -Wilder, W-I-L-D-E-R.
And you work for Tallahassee Police Department.
I do.
How long have you worked there?
24 years.
And what is your role at the Tallahassee Police Department?
I'm currently the lieutenant over the personnel development and recruitment, which is basically our training and recruitment section.
Back in November of 2010, what were your duties there?
I was a homicide investigator.
What does that mean?
We're assigned Criminal Investigation Division. Homicide investigators are also called violent crimes investigators. We investigate anything from assaults, batteries, aggravated assaults, aggravated batteries, and then homicides. We also respond to suicides, accidental deaths, and then unattended deaths that are questionable.
And in November 2010, approximately how long have you been with the homicide investigation at that point?
2.5 to 3 years.
Okay. About how many people are in the homicide, investigators are in the homicide division at that time?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I think it's between almost 8, maybe 8 investigators.
Okay. Lots of them.
Yeah.
All right.
Yes.
During your role there, now as a homicide investigator, you have certain kind of training experience, I assume, to do that?
Yes, we do.
Okay, what is that, if you can?
We go to specialized schools, so like, homicide investigation school, we go to victimology, or can go to victimology school, any kind of advanced training, interviews and interrogations, different things like that.
Okay.
Forensics.
Did you become involved in a homicide investigation at the location of 908 South Creek Run?
I did.
How was it you become involved in that?
It was my day off. I was not on call, but because of the nature of the case, we get called in and come help. And my sergeant called me and asked me to come in and help with the investigation.
What does on-call mean?
On call, so throughout the week, there's always one of us that is dedicated to being the one that gets called to come in. So after, our normal work hours of 8 to 5, if something happens, then there's one of us that is on call to respond. And so we share that throughout the week. It's usually a different person every day or every week. It just depends on how they work it during that time.
And would the on-call officer investigator be typically the one that then is assigned to that case as the lead investigator, for lack of a better term?
Right. If you're on call, you usually get the case. It's usually yours unless you've just been inundated that week or something. But that's normally typically how it works. Is if you're on call, then it's yours, and you're the lead investigator for that case, and then we all come in and assist.
Okay. And so you were not on call, correct?
Right. I was not on call.
So you're not the lead investigator.
Right.
Who was the lead investigator? Who was on call?
Investigator Mark Lewis.
Okay. So what was your role as you responded on November 20th?
When I got to the scene, the sergeant tasked me with assisting with the crime scene, basically being the eyes inside the house for the investigators that are out working.
Okay, why is that important?
There's details inside or things that I see that I can relay to them. They need to be out doing other things, obviously. So we're working as a team, and the scene can tell us some things. They can ask me to look for some things, you know, and it's just kind of it's a way to keep the information flow going.
Okay. So you're tasked now with, I guess, working with the crime scene investigators.
Yes.
Okay. How do they go about, typically, with including your liaison with them, working a scene such as this?
So they have a method that they kind of do it. First, we can kind of talk to the officers that first respond and get an idea of what's inside the house. Then a forensic specialist will go in and they'll actually video the entire scene as it is. And then they'll back out and we'll kind of work out where we think the best way to approach the scene is from. We usually will try to pick an area that is what we consider the least disturbed. You know, you wouldn't want to work right in where everything is and disturb it. First, you want to kind of come from the side that has the least amount of evidence and work your way in through that. So we determined that the back door was probably the best way to come in, and they will then, the specialist will go, after they do the video, they go in and they photograph the pieces of evidence, they then put a marker by the evidence, and then they photograph it again, and then after they've done that, they mark where it is, they'll collect it or swab it, depending on what kind of evidence it is, what they need to do.
Do you recall whether the back door was locked at the time that officers arrived and subsequently had to unlock in order to gain access?
The forensic specialist advised that it was locked, about the bottom handle lock only, not the deadbolt.
The deadbolt was not locked, but the bottom twist one was?
Right.
Okay. All right. And you mentioned the video that is done typically as once entry is made.
Correct.
Okay. Have you had an opportunity to view that video?
I have.
And it's an accurate video of the scene?
It is.
Your Honor, I move Stacy to the number 7 in evidence, please.
Any objection? Be admitted.
And Your Honor, I ask permission to publish the jury.
You may.
My screen was not there. There we go.
You notice it always takes the young person in the room to get the computer working. So,
Thank you for calling me old, Your Honor. Obviously, outside the garage, where, at this point,
I think that was the question.
Okay, I wasn't sure, sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
Yes, this is, so the first officers that went in actually came out the garage, so that's where the technician went in the first time. So this is her coming back in the way that they came out, and it's the garage, yes.
And again, this video is shot as things were found, correct? Other than the officers doing the initial clearing?
Correct, right, this isn't first entry back into the house once it's cleared and they're nobody that needs attention, medical attention or suspects inside, so yes.
And in this particular case, nobody required any medical attention, unfortunately, correct?
Correct.
like that?
Show the state of the house at that time, what was there. Sometimes, it might be important later. All of a sudden, something in the pantry is important that we didn't know about there, so we have it documented.
So it's fair to say that as you're doing this and conducting the crime scene at this point, you don't know what's going to be important and what's not, so you're trying to make sure you get everything.
Absolutely.
This appears to be the little boy's room.
Yes, this is Javante's bedroom.
And this would have been the first bedroom on the left-hand side going down the hallway?
Correct.
And this would be looking into the bedroom that would have been on the right-hand side of the hallway past the bathroom, is that correct?
Right, this is the master
So this is gonna be the master
bedroom,
bedroom?
Brandy's room.
It appears it got brighter there. Did somebody turn the lights on?
Correct.
So the lights would have been off?
The lights were off initially.
What are we looking at there? What is that all that?
It's the contents from the purse. So you see the purse on the ground, and then on the bed, it appears to be everything that would have been in a purse: cards, wallet.
What's through this door? What are we looking at here?
That's the master bathroom. So there's a shower tub and a water closet in there.
Again, the light had to be turned on, it appears?
Yes.
Okay. So you come in, you got the tub and the shower obviously on the right-hand side.
Right.
What's behind that door right there?
That's the toilet, water closet.
TV, was it on whenever officers got it, turned that on, did you?
No, we didn't turn that on. That was on.
Appears that we're out in the hallway again, is that correct?
Yes. There's a linen closet.
Oh, we're talking about right there, linen
Correct.
closet?
Yes.
Which bedroom are we looking at here?
This is the twins' bedrooms, Tamaya and Tanaya.
The lights had to be turned on?
Yes.
TV again, it was on when you got there?
Right, TV was on.
Now, as it relates to the scene, looks like there's a lot there, obviously.
Yes.
Were y'all able to process and do all of your work all on that one day, November 20th, or did you have to go back on more than one occasion?
No, we did the most that they could do that day, then secured the house, and we came back another days.
Okay. How do you go about securing a house for the purposes if you've got multiple days and stuff like that, making sure it remains secure?
Oh, they'll close the doors and secure all the doors with evidence tape, and then we'll post officers at the house.
So it maintains security the entire time?
Maintain security, yes.
When you talk about securing it with evidence tape, how do you go about doing that? I'm sure.
It's tape that once you put on, it's very easily, it tears very easily. So if someone would try to manipulate the tape or open the door, it would tear. You would notice the obvious, disturbance.
So do y'all like put them over the door where if it opened up, you'd have to tear it or cut it or something?
You'd have to know that the door had been manipulated.
Okay. Did you go back for other reasons? Not just secure this crime, not just for crime scene processing, were there other reasons that you went back?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Went back to the scene multiple times.
Okay. What are the purposes? At some point, Mark Lewis, the lead investigator, your purpose is to report back, and you're obviously the liaison with crime scene. Did you ever participate in asking questions of people and things along those lines?
Yes, I did.
Okay. At any point, did you go back to the area when I know it's right next to Capitol Stadium and the fairgrounds, at any point did you go back into the area when there's a game going on or something loud?
Yes, so based on the timing and the time of night and things like that, we went back out at the same exact kind of time of night, and there was a football game going on at the Capitol Stadium.
Why would you go back around the same time of night and stuff like that? What's the purpose of doing that?
People are a habit, and so the people that were home at that time, at the time that we feel like the murder occurred, then that's when we're going to try to see who's home, who might not be home during the day. They're just obviously coming and going, so we're trying to capture most people that might be there at night.
Okay. Did anything, you mentioned that at one point there was a game going on, did anything stand out to you about how loud it was?
Yeah, it was very loud. I've worked nights for many years, so I'm aware that sound travels a lot more at night. Things that occur during the day, I guess there's just filter things that cause it not to travel as much. But at night, you can kind of hear things, and that game was loud.
Did you ever go into one of the homes while that game or anything was going on?
I did.
Anything stand out to you about that?
I didn't hear the game when we were inside the house, so I was kind of surprised as loud as it was out there going in the houses, and we didn't hear that same noise.
So, kind of, well, probably not soundproof, but definitely sound didn't travel very well into the homes from one home to another?
I guess not. Didn't hear it.
Okay. You would agree that gunshots are pretty loud. You've got experience with firearms, correct?
I agree, yes.
Okay. You feel that maybe that because that sound differential you had could mask a gunshot while sitting in another person's house?
It's possible.
And just for clarification, this was in Leon County, correct, the home?
Yes.
Okay. No further questions.
Cross. Did you ever have a question at this point? All right, you can step down.
Okay, thanks.
Do we need to keep her further?
Should we retain, Your Honor, but not, she can go out of business?
Okay.
All right.
We're going to take a lunch break here in just a minute. I haven't forgotten it's lunchtime. Just one comment. If at any point in time you can't hear a witness, just raise your hand. You know, I can manipulate the volume. I want to make sure everybody's hearing. Before you leave, I want to get the deputy, make sure you understand where you're coming back to. I know this building's a little confusing. On the 3rd floor, once you come into the back area, don't go to the front area. We've got witnesses hanging out there, and there's also dependency court going on across the hall, so it gets very confusing out there. So make sure that you understand where you're coming to the back area, and we're on the 3rd floor. Don't let anyone talk to you. Don't talk to anybody about the case. You're going to make sure they're acclimated to where they are, Deputy Granger?
Yes, sir.
All right. Let's plan 1:30. I'm going to give you a little bit longer than normal. This first day eating lunch, you kind of got to figure your way around. There is a snack bar on the 2nd floor that has pretty good food. There's a Metro Deli, Goodies Deli. St. John's Church has a pretty good lunch, so there are, you know, a number of options for your lunch. But anyway, have a good lunch. We'll see you at 1:30. Be seated for just a second. Mr. Prince has indicated by and large he didn't have objection to the evidence. I wonder if we could work something out, just kind of en masse, put most of the evidence in, reserving as to whatever might be contested.
Your Honor, we've discussed doing that. It's the state's intention to do it kind of one at a time, so that way we can point out where each piece was found. We want to have the identificational aspects of it. We're just going to, instead of saying, you know, recognize all that'll be this time we'll move states number 1 into evidence, or if you want, we can do states 1 through whatever into evidence, and then we can point out as we go.
But I'll let y'all discuss it, but it would seem to me we'd save some time just to at least put in the evidence, what's being presented that day or something along those lines. Obviously, they want to tell us where they got it, what the significance of it is. But anyway, I'll let y'all discuss it, work out what you can. Anything else from either side?
No, they are.
All right. Start back at 1:30. Have your witness in place, please. All right. We'll be in recess.
follow through